Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I was driving home from Telluride on Highway 145 when the fog got bad enough that I turned the radio off. It had been a long day already. I worked as a flooring installer then, mostly houses people only lived in for 3 months a year. That Friday I had stayed late fixing a bad transition strip in a mudroom because the owner's property manager, a guy named Reese Calder, kept texting that it had to be perfect before the weekend. By the time I packed up my tools, it was after 8 and the temperature had dropped fast. I should have stayed in town. I almost did. I sat in the gas station lot with a burrito in my lap and watched fog roll through the streetlights like smoke from something burning. A sheriff's SUV pulled in, and for a second I thought about asking how the pass looked. Then I felt dumb and started the truck. I had driven that road plenty of times. I knew the curves. I knew where the guardrails were missing and where deer like to stand right on the shoulder. I figured I would take it slow. For the first 20 minutes, it was just annoying. The fog came in patches, thick enough to make my headlights bounce back at me, then thin enough to show the road again. I kept one hand on the wheel and one on the defroster knob because the windshield kept hazing over from the inside. There weren't many cars out. I passed one plow truck parked near a turnout, even though there wasn't snow yet, just wet road and black trees. The driver's door was open, but I didn't see anyone inside. I remember slowing down a little because that seemed odd. Then a shape moved behind the truck, probably the driver taking a leak, and I kept going. A few miles later, my phone lost service. That happened all the time there, so I didn't care. I had coffee in the cup holder, my tool belt on the passenger floor, and a half-dead flashlight rattling in the door pocket. The fog got thicker after the road bent along the river. It stopped coming in patches and became one solid wall. My high beams made it worse, so I clicked them off. I could only see maybe 2 car lengths ahead. The yellow center line would appear, slide under the hood, and vanish. I dropped to about 25. That was when I noticed the sound. Not a noise exactly, more like the lack of noise. The tires were still hissing on wet pavement and the engine was still running, but everything outside the cab had gone flat. No river, no wind in the trees, no little ticks of gravel under the truck. It felt like I had rolled the windows up tighter somehow. I leaned forward over the steering wheel and told myself to quit being dramatic. Then my headlights found the tunnel. At first, I thought the fog had lifted in a strip ahead of me. The beams reached farther than they had all night, and the road opened up in a clean, straight path about as wide as both lanes. Fog stood on either side of it like white walls, not swirling, not drifting, just there. The edges were too sharp. I slowed down more, almost to a crawl. The clear parts stretched ahead maybe 200 feet, and at the far end, hanging above the road, was a dim light. It wasn't a streetlight. There were no streetlights out there. It wasn't a headlight either, because it didn't spread or move toward me. It hung maybe 15 feet above the center line, small and dull yellow-white, like a porch bulb seen through dirty glass. I stopped the truck. The fog behind me pressed close in the mirrors. Ahead of me was that clean corridor through it, with the light at the end. The trees on both sides were hidden. The road looked dry inside the tunnel, even though my windshield was still dotted with mist. I sat there long enough for my seatbelt to start digging into my shoulder. A car could have come around the curve behind me, so I put the truck in gear again. I moved forward slowly, thinking the fog would break up as I entered it. It didn't. The fog closed behind me as I passed. I saw it happen in the side mirror. The clear space I had just driven through sealed shut from both sides, smooth and quiet, like curtains being pulled together. My brake lights turned the fog red for half a second. Then there was nothing behind me but white. I said, "Nope," out loud, but I kept driving because stopping felt worse. The road inside the tunnel was too clear. My headlights hit pavement, centerline, shoulder, little cracks in the asphalt. The fog walls stayed about 6 feet off each side of the road. They were tall enough that I couldn't see above them. The light at the end stayed the same size. I should have reached it quickly. I was going 15, maybe 20 miles an hour. It was not that far away, but it didn't get closer. The first thing I checked was the speedometer. It worked. Then I checked the odometer, which was stupid, but I watched the 10th mile digit. It changed. The truck was moving. The light stayed at the end of the tunnel. My mouth got dry. I reached for the coffee and knocked it into the passenger footwell. It spilled over my tool belt, and the smell of old coffee filled the cab. The radio clicked on by itself. Not music, just static at low volume. I hit the power button and it shut off. A second later, it clicked on again, same static with a faint ticking under it. Tick, tick, tick. I turned the volume all the way down, but I could still hear the ticking, not from the speakers now. It came from outside, above or behind the truck, slow and even. My headlights flickered once. When they came back steady, there was a road sign on the right shoulder. It was one of those green mile marker signs, but it had no numbers. Just blank reflective green, wet and shining in the headlights. I passed it, looked in the mirror, and saw the fog close over it. A few seconds later, another blank sign appeared on the right. Same size, same place on the shoulder. Then another. I started counting them because that felt like something practical to do. By the 7th one, my hands were shaking. By the 10th, I stopped counting. I tried calling my sister Lena, even though I knew there was no service. The phone screen lit up in the cup holder, and for a second it showed 5 bars. Then it showed no service. Then 5 bars again. I didn't dial. A new notification appeared, but it was just a gray box with no words. No app name, no time, nothing. I swiped it away and put the phone face down. The ticking stopped. The silence that came after was worse. The dim light ahead finally seemed to grow a little larger. Not much, just enough that I could tell it wasn't round. It had corners. Soft corners, like a square hidden behind foggy glass. It hung above the center line without any pole or wire that I could see. I rolled my window down an inch because the cab felt too small. Cold, wet air came in. It smelled like mud and pine, but also something electrical. Not burning, just that sharp smell you get near old copy machines or after a transformer pops. Then I heard footsteps. They were on my left side, inside the fog wall, matching the truck's speed. Gravel crunch. Pause. Gravel crunch. I looked left and saw nothing but white. The fog was close enough that my window reflected my own face back at me. I rolled it up too fast and pinched my finger in the switch for a second. The footsteps kept going. I sped up. The sound sped up. I slowed down. It slowed down. I stopped. The steps stopped beside my door. The engine idled. My wipers squeaked across the windshield even though I didn't remember turning them on. The light hung ahead, dim and patient. Something touched the outside of the driver's door, not a knock, more like fingertips resting against the metal. I heard 3 soft taps slide down near the handle. I stared straight ahead. I did not look at the window. I knew there would be nothing there, and I knew I would see something anyway if I looked long enough. The door lock clicked. I had locked it when I left Telluride. I always did. The little tab by the window jumped up, then down, then up again. I hit the lock button with my thumb and held it there until the motor buzzed angrily. The radio came on again, louder this time. Through the static, I heard my own voice. It was not clear, but it was close enough. A few words repeated under the hiss. Keep going. Then static. Keep going. I shoved the gear into drive and pressed the gas harder than I meant to. The truck lurched and the rear tires slipped on wet pavement. For a second, the fog walls bowed inward, like the headlights had pushed them. Then they straightened. The light came closer now. I could see the road under it. The center line stopped about 10 feet before the light, like the paint had been scraped clean. The asphalt there looked darker and smooth, almost new. My headlights showed no object hanging above the road. No fixture, no cable, nothing holding the light up. As I approached, the truck's engine started to drag. The RPMs dipped, then climbed, then dipped again. The dashboard lights dimmed. The airbag light came on, then the seatbelt warning chimed even though I still had mine on. I passed under the light. For 1 second, the whole cab filled with a dull yellow glow. Every hair on my arms lifted. My teeth hurt. The coffee on the floor trembled in tiny rings. The ticking came back, but this time it was inside my head or behind my ears. I looked in the rearview mirror. The fog tunnel behind me was gone. The road behind me was clear for maybe 20 feet, then solid fog. No light, no signs, no white walls, just normal heavy fog. Ahead, the road looked normal too. Bad visibility, wet pavement, trees leaning over the shoulder. I was still on Highway 145. I could hear the river again. I pulled into the next turnout and sat with the truck running. My phone said 10:47. That was wrong. I had left Telluride a little after 8. Even driving slowly, I should have been home by 9:30. The place where I pulled over was maybe 15 minutes from my house. I checked the call log. No calls, no recording, no notification, nothing. Then I noticed my trip odometer. Before I left that morning, I had reset it while filling gas. It should have been around 80 miles, maybe 90, with the job site and store stops. It said 184.6. I wrote it down on an old receipt because I didn't trust myself to remember it right. My hand shook so much that the numbers came out crooked. When I got home, my wife, Tessa, was sitting on the couch with all the lights on. She asked where I had been. I told her the fog was bad. She said she had called me 9 times. My phone showed none of them. She showed me hers. The calls were there. They had all gone through, and each one showed a length of 2 or 3 seconds, like someone had answered and hung up. I asked what she heard. She said the first few were just static. On the last one, right before it disconnected, she heard what sounded like me breathing very close to the phone. I told her I hadn't answered. She believed me. But I could tell she didn't want to talk about it anymore. Neither did I. I went out to the truck the next morning in full daylight. The fog was gone, and the sky was bright blue in that cold mountain way that makes everything look too sharp. There were streaks on the driver's door. 3 of them. They started near the handle and ran downward about a foot, thin and clean through the road grime. They looked like marks left by fingers, except too long and too straight. I tried wiping them with my sleeve, but they weren't residue. The grime around them came off, and the marks stayed dull underneath like the clear coat had been rubbed flat. The antenna was bent forward over the roof. My radio presets were gone. In the passenger footwell, my tool belt was still soaked with coffee. Sitting on top of it was a small green mile marker sign about the size of a postcard. At least that was what it looked like at first. It was thin metal, reflective, with rounded corners. No numbers. No holes where screws would go. One side was green, the other side was bare aluminum, scratched in a perfect square. I had no idea how it got inside the cab. The doors had been locked, the windows were up. I had not stopped anywhere after the turnout. I put it in the garage on a shelf behind a paint can because I didn't know what else to do with it. For 3 days, nothing happened. Then I started hearing the ticking at night. Only in the house, only after everyone had gone to bed. It came from different places. The laundry room once, the hallway once, the wall behind the fridge twice. Slow and even, never more than 10 or 12 ticks. Tessa heard it one time while brushing her teeth and asked if we had mice. I said maybe. On the 4th night, I walked into the garage to check the shelf. The green piece was gone. There was a damp square on the wood where it had been sitting. The paint can beside it had a ring of moisture around the bottom. The garage smelled faintly like wet pine and electricity. I didn't tell Tessa about that part. A week later, I had to drive that same road again for work. I tried to get out of it, but we were short 2 guys and the job was already scheduled. I left early in the morning to avoid being up there after dark. The weather was clear the whole way. I found the turnout where I thought I had stopped that night. There was a county road sign nearby and a pull-off with tire tracks in the mud. I parked and walked back along the shoulder, looking for anything that matched what I remembered. About a 1/4 mile down, I found the blank green sign. It stood on the right shoulder, mounted to a normal metal post. Same size as a mile marker, same reflective green face, no numbers. There were no other signs like it nearby. At the bottom of the post, in the mud, were tire tracks. They were mine. I knew because one of my rear tires had a weird chunk missing from the tread, and it left a notch in the print. The tracks came off the road, circled the sign once, and went back onto the pavement. I did not remember leaving the road. I stood there with trucks passing behind me, feeling embarrassed and scared at the same time. I took a photo of the sign. In the picture, it looked normal, except for being blank. I took another from farther back. That was when I saw the light in the photo. It wasn't in front of me when I took it. I know it wasn't, but in the picture, far down the road where the trees bent over the pavement, a dim square light hung above the center line. I looked up. Nothing was there. I got back in the truck and drove straight to the job without stopping. I got to Gulf State Park Pier a little after 6 because I liked being there before the beach crowd showed up. It was one of those gray Alabama mornings where the air felt wet even before it rained. The sky and water were almost the same color, and the end of the pier looked like it was floating out in nothing. I had my old tackle box, 2 rods, a folding chair with a torn cup holder, and a thermos of gas station coffee that tasted burned but did the job. There were only 3 other people out there when I walked down. A retired guy named Donnie was near the middle, cleaning his reel with a rag. I had seen him around a few times, but we weren't friends. Near the end, a young couple had a crab net dropped over the rail. They were whispering and laughing like they were trying not to wake the water. I set up on the left side, maybe 30 yards from the end. The wind was light, coming from behind me, and the water below had that slow rolling look it gets before weather. Not rough. Not calm, just moving. For the first hour, nothing happened except a few hardhead catfish and 1 ladyfish that threw the hook right as I lifted it. I remember being annoyed about that because I had just sharpened those hooks the night before. Around 7:30, the couple packed up and left. Donnie walked past me not long after and said the radar looked bad. "Storm lines building west," he said. "You staying?" "Maybe a little longer," I said. He nodded like that was a dumb answer, but not his problem. After he left, I had the pier to myself. That was when I first noticed the light. At first, I thought it was the reflection of someone's phone or a boat light, but there weren't any boats close enough, and the sun still wasn't really out. It was under the water, maybe 15 or 20 feet down, pale and soft like a glow stick wrapped in cloth. Not bright enough to shine on the pilings, but bright enough that I could see it against the darker water. It moved from left to right in a straight line. I leaned over the rail and watched it, thinking it was probably a school of baitfish catching some weird light. But it didn't move like fish. It didn't wiggle or scatter. It went straight for maybe 10 feet, stopped, turned 90 degrees, and moved away from the pier. Then it stopped again. Then it turned again. After the 4th turn, I realized it had made a square. A perfect square. I stood there with my rod in my hand, feeling stupid for even thinking the word perfect, but that was what it was. Each side looked the same length. Each corner was sharp. It traced the square once, then paused at the spot where it had started. I looked up and down the pier. Nobody was there. The water made its normal sounds against the pilings. A gull landed on the rail farther down, looked at me, then hopped sideways a few steps. Everything else seemed ordinary. The light started moving again. Same square, same speed, same sharp stops. I pulled my phone out to record it, but the screen was wet from the mist and didn't respond right away. By the time I wiped it on my shirt and got the camera open, the light had drifted farther out. I hit record anyway. On the phone, I could barely see anything, just gray water, my own breathing, the rail, and a tiny pale smudge that looked like nothing. In real life, it was clear. It finished the square for a 3rd time, then moved toward the pier. Not under the surface like something floating. Deeper than that. It passed over darker patches where the bottom dropped off and stayed the same brightness. It didn't throw a beam. It didn't ripple the water. It just came straight in. I stepped back from the rail without meaning to. My bait bucket was by my foot, and the little pinfish inside started slapping around. Not jumping, exactly. More like they were all trying to get to one side of the bucket at the same time. The light stopped directly below me. I could see it through the gaps between the planks, pale and round now, about the size of a dinner plate. It wasn't touching the surface. The water above it stayed normal. No bubbles, no swirl, no heat shimmer, nothing. I held still because I had the strong feeling that moving would be noticed. That sounds ridiculous, but it was the first thought that came into my head. Like when you see a dog watching you from across a yard and you don't know if it's friendly. The gull on the rail made a small sound and flew off. Then the light faded. It didn't shoot away or sink. It just dimmed until it was gone, and the water under the pier looked like water again. I stayed there for a long time, longer than made sense. My line was still in the water. The rod tip dipped once, and I didn't even touch it. My hands felt weak, like I had just carried something heavy. I told myself it had been a diver. Then I remembered there were no bubbles, no boat, no flag, and the light had made a square like it was following edges only it could see. The rain started about 10 minutes later. Not hard, just a steady fine rain that made the pier shine. I reeled in and decided I was done. When I bent down to close my tackle box, I noticed my second rod was gone from where I had leaned it against the bench. I looked around, thinking it had slipped. It hadn't. It was lying flat on the planks about 8 feet behind me, pointing lengthwise down the pier. The line was still wrapped around the guide from when I had rigged it earlier. Nothing was broken. I picked it up and laughed once because that was easier than reacting any other way. Then something knocked under the pier. 3 taps. Not loud, hollow, wood on wood almost. I froze with the rod halfway in my hand. A few seconds passed. 3 more taps came from below, a little farther out. I looked through the planks. I couldn't see anything except dark water moving between the pilings. I walked fast then, not running, but close. My tackle box banged against my knee. The rain got heavier, and the pier felt much longer going back than it had coming out. Halfway to shore, I heard the taps again behind me. 3 of them. I turned around. The far end of the pier was empty. Rain blurred the railings and the white caps beyond them. For a second, I thought I saw a pale patch under the water near the end, but it disappeared before I could tell. By the time I reached the parking lot, my shirt was soaked through. There were 2 cars there besides mine. One was Donnie's old green Ford, which surprised me because I thought he had left. He was sitting inside with the engine running. I walked over and knocked on his passenger window. He stared at me for a second before rolling it down. "You see anything weird out there?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. His face looked tired and pinched, like he had a headache. "What'd you see?" he said. I didn't like that he asked it that way. "Light under the water," I said, "moving around." He looked past me toward the pier. "Square?" he asked. I felt my stomach drop. I asked him what he meant, but he shook his head and rolled the window up a little, not all the way. "Go home," he said. "Don't fish this tide." Then he backed out and left. I sat in my truck with the heater on, even though it wasn't cold. I checked my phone. The video was 38 seconds long, and it showed almost nothing. Just rain starting, gray water, and me whispering, "What is that?" near the end. The strange part was the timestamp. I had filmed it at 7:42, but when I checked the time in the truck, it was 9:18. That didn't make sense. I had not been on the pier another hour and a half. I knew I hadn't. Donnie had passed me around 7:30. The couple had left before that. The light had appeared soon after. I looked through my photos, thinking maybe the phone had glitched. It hadn't. The video said 7:42. My last text to my wife, Marissa, was at 6:11, saying I had made it to the pier. At 8:03, she had texted, "Rain bad there?" I had never answered. I didn't remember hearing the message come in. I drove home with both hands tight on the wheel. The highway back toward Foley was wet and shiny, and every car behind me looked too close. About 5 miles from the pier, a white SUV stayed behind me through 3 turns. It was probably nothing. I knew it was probably nothing. But whenever I looked in the mirror, I felt that same watched feeling I'd had over the water. At home, Marissa was in the kitchen making toast. She asked why I looked so pale. I told her I had seen a weird light under the pier. She smiled at first because she thought I meant a jellyfish or some fishing story. Then I showed her the video and the timestamps. She watched it twice. The video still looked like nothing, but my voice on it didn't sound like me. It sounded flat and scared. She asked why I kept whispering after the light disappeared. I said I didn't. She played it again and turned the volume up. After I said, "What is that?" there were several seconds of rain and water. Then, very quietly, my voice said, "It's right below me." I did not remember saying that. Marissa told me I should call somebody. I asked who exactly I was supposed to call. The park office? The police? The weather service? It sounded ridiculous as soon as I thought about saying it out loud, so I did nothing. For the rest of the day, I felt wrong. Not sick, just off by a few inches inside myself. I kept walking into rooms and forgetting why. I took a shower and found a reddish mark across my left palm, like I had grabbed something rough. It didn't hurt, it was just there. That evening, I went out to the garage to clean my gear. My tackle box was wet inside, even though it had been latched. The hooks had rusted in a few spots already, which made no sense. Saltwater does that, but not in one day like that. When I opened the side pocket of my fishing bag, I found a small clump of seagrass wrapped around the handle of my pliers. I hadn't used those pliers that morning. They had been in the zipped pocket the whole time. I stood there holding the bag while the garage light buzzed overhead. Marissa called from inside asking if I was okay, and I said yes, too fast. That night, I woke up around 2:30 because our dog, Jasper, was whining at the back door. He never did that unless he needed to go out, so I got up and let him into the yard. The rain had stopped, but everything was wet. The neighborhood was quiet, except for water dripping from the gutters. Jasper walked halfway into the grass and froze. I looked past him toward the fence. There was a pale glow on the other side. Not bright, not moving. Just a soft white patch showing between two fence boards, low to the ground. I thought maybe it was a neighbor's security light reflecting in a puddle, but our back fence faced a drainage ditch, not a house. Jasper backed up until he bumped into my leg. The glow slid sideways. It moved maybe 6 feet, stopped, then moved straight away from the fence. I could tell by how the light thinned between the boards. It was doing the same thing again. Straight line. Stop. Stop. Sharp turn. I shut the door and locked it. Marissa woke up when I came back to bed, and I told her Jasper had gotten spooked by a raccoon. I don't know why I lied. Maybe because saying it out loud would have made it part of our house. In the morning, I went out back before work. The grass near the fence was flattened in 4 straight lines, making a square about 8 feet across. It could have been the dog. It could have been rainwater running off the roof. It could have been me noticing patterns because I was tired and scared. That was what I kept telling myself while I stood there. Near one corner of the square, stuck in the mud, was a fishing weight, a 1-ounce pyramid sinker with green line tied to it. I used that exact kind. I had lost one the day before when my line snagged under the pier. I picked it up, then dropped it because it was cold enough to hurt. Not freezer cold, worse somehow, like touching metal that had been sitting in deep shade all winter. I left it in the yard. For 2 weeks after that, I didn't fish. I went to work, came home, acted normal, and checked the backyard every morning before Marissa woke up. Nothing else showed up. The square in the grass slowly blended back in. Then Donnie called me. I had never given him my number. He said, "You still got that video?" I asked how he got my number. He ignored that and said, "Don't send it to nobody." I asked him what was happening. There was a long pause and I could hear wind on his end. He said he had seen the square pattern 3 times over the years. Once at the pier, once in Wolf Bay, once in a canal behind his brother's place. "It don't like noise," he said. "What doesn't?" He breathed hard through his nose. "Just don't go looking," he said. Then the call ended. I checked my recent calls after. The number showed as unknown. That afternoon, I drove back to the pier parking lot, but didn't get out. I don't know what I expected to find. The day was sunny and hot, with families walking back from the beach and kids carrying buckets. The pier looked normal. People were fishing. Birds were fighting over bait scraps. A guy in a red shirt was leaning over the rail right around where I had been standing. I watched him for maybe 5 minutes. Then he straightened up and looked down through the planks. I started the truck and left before I could see anything else. On the way home, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was the video from that morning at the pier somehow playing in my gallery preview. I had not opened it. The thumbnail was different now. Instead of gray water, it showed the planks at my feet. Between them, in the dark gap below, there was a pale circle of light directly under the pier. I pulled over at a gas station and opened the video. It was still 38 seconds. It still showed mostly nothing. But at the very end, after my whispered words and the rain sounds, there was one clear frame that had not been there before. A square of pale light sat under the water directly below me. Inside the square were 4 darker spots, one near each corner. They looked like holes. Then the video ended. I saw the fence posts shake before I saw the light. That was what made me stop the truck. It was just after dusk, not fully dark yet, that in-between time when the sky still held a little color but the ground had already gone flat and gray. I'd been out checking the north pasture because one of the calves had been favoring a leg that afternoon, and I wanted to make sure she hadn't slipped through a break in the fence before the temperature dropped. My name's Wade Mercer. My family's place sat outside a small town in eastern Colorado where the land ran open for miles and every sound traveled farther than it should. We had wheat on one side, grazing land on the other, and a low stand of cottonwoods along the creek at the far edge of the property. Nothing dramatic about it. Fences, gates, stock tanks, windbreaks, same routine every day, same roads, same sections of field. That evening had been weird from the start, though I didn't think much of it at first. Too still. That was the best way to put it. All afternoon, there had been this heavy heat hanging around even after the sun started going down. No breeze through the grass, no movement in the trees by the creek. The sky was clear, but the air felt like it was waiting on a storm that never arrived. I drove the old side-by-side out past the equipment shed and along the service track that ran beside the north pasture. The fence line on that side went on forever. Old cedar posts with 2 strands of barbed wire and one newer patch where I'd repaired storm damage the year before. The cattle were farther off in the field, grouped near the low rise by the tank, dark shapes against darker ground. I was maybe halfway to the back gate when I noticed one of the fence posts trembling, not leaning, not loose in the soil, vibrating. It was subtle enough at first that I thought my eyes were catching the engine vibration from the side-by-side. I eased off the throttle and looked again. The nearest post, maybe 30 feet ahead of me, shivered for a second and then stopped. Then the next one down the line did it. Then the next. Not all at once, one after another, like something invisible was moving beside the fence, close enough that each post reacted when it reached it. I stopped the side-by-side completely and killed the engine. The sudden silence out there should have made it easier to understand what I was seeing. It didn't. The posts kept vibrating in sequence, moving away from me toward the back corner of the pasture, each one trembling for maybe half a second before the next one took over. Not hard enough to rattle the wire loose, but enough that the metal staples flashed faintly in the dim light, and the barbed wire sang just a little. That thin metallic hum you only hear if you're standing close. I climbed down and stood with one hand still on the roll cage, staring. The line of motion traveled along the fence at a steady pace. It didn't jump from post to post randomly. It moved with intention. One, then the next, carrying on toward the woods by the creek. I remember saying, "What the hell?" because there wasn't any other sound to put in the air. No wind. No vehicle on the county road. No insects. That got to me too. By that time of evening, there should have been crickets and the first tree frogs from the creek. Instead, the whole place was flat quiet, except for the occasional tiny buzz from the fence wire as each post vibrated and settled. I walked closer. The nearest post I could reach had stopped moving by then, but I put my hand on it anyway. Still, cold, solid in the ground. Then 10 yards farther down, the next one shook. I flinched at that, not because it was violent, but because it was so controlled. The movement didn't look like wind or ground shift or an animal brushing past. It looked like a tight mechanical vibration, quick and exact, and then it was gone, past to the next post. I followed it with my eyes as far as I could. The line of trembling reached the newer patch I'd repaired and continued through it without changing speed. If it had been the wire itself somehow carrying a resonance, I'd have expected it to behave differently, where the tension changed. It didn't. The posts shook in the same pattern, one by one, moving steadily toward the far corner. That was when I noticed the glow. It hung above the field beyond the fence line, low and dull, like almost the color of old moonlight through cloud. Not bright enough to light the ground beneath it, but bright enough that once I saw it, I couldn't believe I'd missed it before. It sat maybe 20 feet above the pasture, maybe lower, and drifted slowly toward the creek woods. No flashing, no beam, no sharp edges, just a soft, pale glow moving across the field at the same pace the vibration moved down the fence. I looked back at the posts, still going, looked at the glow again. Still moving toward the woods. That was the first moment my brain tried hard to force a normal explanation. Some farm drone, some utility survey gear, maybe headlights from the far road hitting low cloud or dust in a strange way. But none of that fit. There was no dust, no clouds, no engine sound, and if it had been any kind of machine moving that close to the ground, the cattle should have been reacting. They weren't. I looked out toward them and saw the whole group standing still, heads up, facing the same direction as the glow. No milling, no bolting, no nervous shifting, just stillness. That bothered me in a different way than the fence. Animals out there react to everything. Coyotes on the road, storms miles away, loose dogs, anything. But the cattle looked almost paused, like they were waiting on the same thing I was. The glow moved on. It wasn't fast. That somehow made it worse. A fast light could have been a vehicle or a bad angle or my own eyes getting fooled by dusk. This moved with slow confidence, low and steady over the grass, not touching it, not throwing any visible light ahead or behind. The fence posts continued trembling one after another as if whatever that thing was, it had a physical path beside the fence, even if I couldn't see anything there. I started walking after it. That sounds bolder than it felt. Really, I was taking slow, careful steps along the inside of the fence line because standing still somehow felt worse. The grass brushed my jeans and made almost no sound. The ground was dry and hard. Every few seconds, a post farther ahead would buzz and shiver and stop. Then the next one would take it up. The glow had reached the middle of the pasture by then, closing on the line of cottonwoods near the creek. Its color changed a little as the light drained from the sky. Less white now, more gray-blue. It still didn't brighten the grass beneath it. That part never stopped feeling wrong. You could see it clearly, but it didn't seem to illuminate the world the way any real light should. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the camera. No signal, which wasn't unusual at that end of the property, but the camera opened fine. On the screen, the glow looked weaker and farther away, almost easy to dismiss. The fence posts were worse. The phone couldn't capture their movement properly in the low light, just tiny jerks in the frame that could have been anything. I recorded anyway. While I did, the post nearest me suddenly trembled hard enough that the wire gave a short, dry twang. I jumped and nearly dropped the phone. The vibration wasn't random. It felt like it had reached my position. I backed away from the fence, one step, then another. The next post down the line shook, then the next. Whatever was moving beside that fence was still heading toward the woods and hadn't stopped just because I'd gotten close. I told myself then that if the glow reached the trees and disappeared, I was getting back in the side-by-side and going home. No more trying to understand it. No more following along like I had a right to be near it. The glow kept drifting. The last little strip of color faded out of the sky, and the whole pasture went into that deep dusk where the land becomes one piece and only movement separates anything. The cottonwoods at the creek turned into a solid black wall. The glow approached them and did not change. The fence post line had almost reached the back corner by then. Then something else happened. The cattle moved, all at once, but not away. They took maybe 3 or 4 slow steps backward as a group, heads still pointed toward the glow. Not panicked. Not running, just giving ground. I've never seen cattle do that so neatly. Usually one moves, then another, then the rest follow. This was closer to one decision carried through several bodies. The glow reached the edge of the woods. I braced myself for it to vanish behind the trunks, and part of me was grateful for that, because at least trees made sense. Things go behind trees. That's how distance works. It didn't go behind them. It passed in front of the first line of trunks without lighting them, slipped into the darkness between them, and for a second I could still see the pale shape moving where there should only have been black timber. Then it dimmed. Not suddenly. Just enough that I had to strain to keep it in sight. At the same time, the last fence post in the back corner vibrated once, hard, and the wire along the whole line gave one long, faint hum that faded into the still air. Then nothing moved. The glow was gone in the trees. The posts were still. The cattle remained where they were, staring at the woods, and the sound came back. Not all at once. First, a single insect somewhere behind me, then another, Then the dry, constant layer of evening noise spread back over the field as if someone had slowly opened a valve. A breeze moved through the grass just enough to make the wire click against one staple. The cottonwoods stirred. Far off on the county road, I heard a truck go by. The world resumed. I stood there longer than I should have, waiting for another post to shake, for the glow to reappear farther along the creek, for the cattle to bolt, for anything that would help me file it under some category I knew. Nothing happened. Eventually, I walked back to the side-by-side without turning my back fully on the woods until I had to. I drove home slower than normal, headlights bouncing across the service track, and every fence post I passed looked too rigid and ordinary. My wife had already gone to bed, and I didn't wake her. I sat at the kitchen table instead with the phone video and watched it 3 or 4 times. The glow was there, yes, pale and low, moving toward the trees. The posts, sort of. Enough to see movement if you already knew where to look. Not enough to convince anyone who wasn't standing there. The next morning, I went back before full daylight. No marks in the field, no tracks beside the fence. The posts were solid when I checked them. The wire tension was normal. At the back corner near the cottonwoods, the grass looked undisturbed. The creek bank was damp from overnight dew and showed only the usual raccoon and deer prints. The cattle were already grazing like nothing had happened. For about a week after that, I found excuses to walk that fence line at dusk. Nothing moved, nothing glowed. The crickets kept up their usual noise and the wind behaved like wind. But even now, if I'm out near the north pasture at that same hour and the air goes too still, I find myself watching the posts before I look anywhere else. I woke up because the inside of the tent had changed color. That was the first thing my brain understood. One side of the nylon wall, the side facing the trees, had gone from black to this pale, steady white. Not bright enough to turn the whole tent into daylight, but strong enough that I could see the seam lines in the fabric, the outline of my boots by the door, and the shape of my backpack leaning against the corner. It was like someone had set a work light outside and aimed it right at the tent. I stayed still for a second, not because I was scared yet, but because I was trying to place it. My name's Travis Keene. I'd been camping alone that weekend at a Forest Service site beside a reservoir in Northern California. Nothing deep wilderness, nothing dramatic. Just one of those quiet, half-maintained campgrounds where the sites were spaced out enough to feel private, with pine trees all around and a dirt road looping through. A few of the sites had families earlier that evening, but by the time I crawled into the tent, it had gone quiet enough that I couldn't even tell if anyone else was still awake. The weather had been clear when I went to sleep. Cold, but not hard cold. Dry air, still water on the reservoir, stars through the trees. I remember that because I'd stood by the dead fire ring for a while before bed, just looking up and listening to the occasional tiny splash from the shore below. So when I opened my eyes and saw that white glow through the tent wall, my first thought was headlights. Some idiot driving through the campground too fast. But it didn't move. That was what made me push myself up on one elbow. Headlights sweep, flashlights jitter, lanterns have a warmer color. This light just held there on the fabric, even in white and still. I checked my phone screen, 2:18 a.m., battery at 31%, no service, which was normal up there. I turned the screen off and listened. No engine, no footsteps, no voices, no wind either. That part mattered because if somebody was standing outside with a flashlight, I should have heard something. Gravel, brush, a zipper, a cough, anything. Instead, there was just the faint sound of my own sleeping bag shifting as I moved and the low, almost silence you get in the woods after midnight. The glow stayed fixed on the tent wall. It came from low enough outside that it should have cast some kind of angle across the interior, but it didn't feel directional in the normal way. One half of the tent was lit, yes, but the light wasn't behaving like a beam. It was more like the fabric itself on that side had started glowing. I sat up fully then. The tent was a 2-person dome, cheap but decent, olive green outside and pale gray inside. My head nearly brushed the top if I sat straight. I could see the mesh pocket by my knee, the metal zipper pull of my duffel bag, even the bottle of water I'd left by the door. All of that was only visible because of the white light on the wall. I waited for it to flicker. It didn't. I waited for it to slide away like a passing car. It didn't. It held exactly the same brightness, exactly the same shape. That was when I started feeling uneasy. I leaned closer to the lit wall and looked at the texture of the nylon. The ripstop grid showed clearly. Behind it there were shadows, but not the shadows you'd expect from branches or a person. Just a broad, pale pressure of light from outside and nothing distinct inside it. I remember thinking that if someone had a flashlight on the tent, I should see movement from their hand. Even the steadiest person makes tiny corrections. The beam edge trembles. This didn't tremble. It just existed. I cleared my throat and said, "Hello." The word sounded flat and too loud in the tent. Nothing answered. No footsteps retreating. No voice saying sorry. Nothing. I looked at the door flap. It was zipped shut, but the mesh panel behind it was only half covered. If I leaned a little, I could have looked through the dark part of the mesh toward the center of the campsite. I didn't do that right away. Instead, I stayed still and listened again. There was a faint hum in the air. Not from the light exactly, or maybe it was. Hard to tell. It was low enough that I almost mistook it for pressure in my ears. Not mechanical, not generator-like, just a thin, steady tone that seemed to live behind the silence rather than inside it. I'd had a lantern on the picnic table earlier, and for half a second I wondered if I'd somehow left it on and forgotten. That would have been embarrassing, but at least it would have been normal. Then I remembered I'd packed it in the truck. The glow on the wall brightened slightly. Not a lot, just enough that the far side of the tent floor became a little more visible, and the zipper teeth on the duffel bag caught light. That made the decision for me. I reached for the small flashlight in the mesh pocket, found it, and thumbed it on. The beam inside the tent looked weak and yellow against the white glow. That bothered me more than it should have. I clicked it back off. Then I slid one hand slowly toward the zipper of the door. The low hum stayed steady. I told myself very calmly that I was about to unzip the door and see some simple thing. A campground vehicle. Someone with a bright LED work light. Maybe moonlight reflecting off something stupid, even though I knew there had been no moon that night. My hand was shaking a little by then. I remember because the zipper pull made a tiny metallic tap against the ring when I touched it. I took a breath and pulled the zipper down 6 inches. The light snapped off instantly. The tent went black, not dimmer, not fading away. 1 second I was bathed in that pale glow, and the next I was in ordinary darkness with only the weak rectangle of my phone screen when I panicked and woke it up by accident. I froze with the zipper half open. The sudden absence of the light was almost worse than the light itself. Because now the whole campsite outside the tent should have been visible through that gap if there had been a source. A person, a lamp, headlights, anything. There was nothing, just black trees, the edge of the picnic table, and the faint shape of the fire ring. I opened the zipper the rest of the way and stared out. The campsite looked exactly like I'd left it. Camp chair tipped slightly toward the table. Cooler by the bench. My truck parked nose out near the spur road. No lights on, no doors open, no other person standing there, and no white glow anywhere. The air outside was still cold and still. I listened hard enough that my ears started inventing sounds. The reservoir below the trees gave back one faint little lap of water. Something in the brush farther down clicked or shifted once, then nothing again. The hum was gone too, completely. I got out of the tent in my socks and stood in the dirt with the flashlight in one hand, sweeping it slowly around the site. Nothing. No footprints I could see, though the ground was hard and pine needles covered most of it anyway. No lantern, no headlamps moving through the trees, no car on the campground road. The nearest occupied site had looked empty when I'd gone to bed, and it looked empty now too. Cold fire ring, picnic table, no car. I walked around the side of the tent where the glow had been strongest. The outside fabric was dark and ordinary. No heat on it, no dampness, no shadow of a light source receding through the trees. Just the tent wall and the trunks behind it and the steep drop of darkness toward the reservoir. I shined my light into the trees, half expecting eye shine from a deer or raccoon. Nothing looked back. I don't know how long I stood there. Maybe a minute, maybe 5. Long enough that my feet got cold through my socks and the stupid practical part of my mind started telling me to put shoes on, because standing half-dressed in the dark looking for impossible light sources was not a good plan. I went back into the tent, put on my boots, and came back out with my jacket. Still nothing. I even walked to the truck and checked inside in case somehow some interior light or screen had been left on in a way that could have bounced toward the tent. Everything inside was dark. I unlocked it, checked the cab, checked the bed, then locked it again. The campsite remained ordinary around me. That was when I started feeling the wrongness settle in a little deeper. Not because something was actively happening, but because it had stopped too cleanly the second I unzipped the tent, like it had only ever existed while I was inside with the door closed. I thought about getting in the truck and leaving right then. I really did. But the campground road was narrow and rough, and some stubborn part of me didn't want to give in to whatever this was if it turned out to be nothing. So instead, I stayed awake. I sat in the camp chair with my flashlight off and watched the tent from outside. If the glow came back, I figured at least I'd see whether it showed on the outer fabric the same way it had lit the inside. For maybe 20 minutes, nothing happened. The woods stayed normal. A little breeze finally stirred the pine branches above, just enough to make them whisper once and then settle. Farther off across the campground, I heard a truck door shut and then an engine turnover, faint and distant. That should have comforted me. It almost did. Then Bruno, sorry, wrong name, that's someone else's dog. I had no dog there. What I heard instead was a single owl call from somewhere up the slope. One call, then no second one. The tent stayed dark. I checked my phone again, 2:46. The battery had dropped to 23%, which seemed too much for that short span, though maybe I'd just been using it more than I thought. I put it on airplane mode and slipped it into my jacket pocket. A few minutes later, I saw the glow again, not inside the tent, around it. The side of the tent that had lit up earlier now had a faint pale rim along the outside edge, as though the light were back, but positioned slightly behind the fabric from where I sat. It wasn't enough to illuminate the whole site, just enough to outline that side of the tent in a thin white sheen. I stood up so fast the chair legs scraped the dirt. The glow vanished immediately. Again, no fade, no movement, just off. I swung the flashlight toward the tent. Nothing there. I went around it once more, quicker this time, shining the beam behind tree trunks and into brush and between the parked truck and the table. Nothing. That second event was shorter, maybe only 2 seconds total, but it settled something in me. I wasn't going back to sleep there. I packed in a hurry after that. Not loud, but without any of the normal care I'd use trying not to wake other campers. Sleeping bag stuffed, not rolled. Tent stakes yanked fast and shoved into the sack, muddy. Cooler thrown into the truck bed. Chair folded crooked. All the while I kept looking at the side of the tent where the glow had been. It never returned. By 3:05, I was driving out of the campground, headlights bouncing off trunks and signs and the little reflective markers at the road edge. The whole way down, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see some pale light among the trees behind me. Nothing. I got home around 4 and left the gear in the truck until daylight. The next afternoon, I drove back up there. I told myself I was going because I'd probably left something behind in the rush, but really I wanted to see the site in daylight and force it back into proportion. In daylight, it was exactly what it had always been. Dirt pad, fire ring, picnic table, truck-sized parking spur. Trees on 3 sides and the reservoir glittering through them. No hidden lampposts, no cabins tucked beyond the brush, no reflective surfaces positioned to throw clean white light onto a tent wall. Nothing. The site looked smaller than it had at night. That almost made it worse. I still camp alone. I didn't stop because of that one night. But I do check the inside of the tent once after I zip it now, before I try to sleep. Not for snakes or spiders or gear. Just to make sure the walls stay dark the way they're supposed to. I noticed the compass first, because the map app wouldn't settle. I'd parked at a scenic overlook on the edge of a state highway, the kind of pull-off with a cracked little stone wall, one weathered sign about local geology, and a view people probably appreciated a lot more in daylight. At night, it was mostly just a safe place to stop if you wanted quiet and open sky. My name's Owen Harland. I'd left a friend's place later than I meant to and wasn't ready to go straight home, so I pulled off there to sit for a minute and clear my head. It was just after 11, cold enough that my windshield had started to fog at the corners if I sat too long with the engine off, but clear overhead. No rain, no wind worth mentioning, just a dark valley below and ridges stacked behind it. I'd been there maybe 5 minutes, scrolling absently on my phone, when I opened maps to check a back road my friend had mentioned and saw the little compass icon spinning. Not twitching. Spinning. I held the phone flat and watched the red needle sweep around in a full circle, hesitate, then turn again. The blue dot stayed put in the overlook lot, but the orientation kept rotating like I was turning in place. I wasn't moving. At first I assumed it was the phone case magnet or something dumb like that. I took the case off, held the phone up, then flat again. The compass kept spinning. That was strange enough that I sat up a little and looked around the car, as if there might be some obvious source. Keys in the cup holder, sunglasses, receipts, nothing metal out of the ordinary. The truck's dash was dark, except for the dim clock and the radio display. I even moved the phone closer to the passenger window, then toward the steering wheel, just to see if it changed. No difference. The compass whirled once more. Slower this time, then jerked north, then west, then moved again. That gave me the first real sense that something was off. The overlook faced south over a broad valley with a river somewhere down in the dark and a scattering of farm lights far off near the opposite ridge. In daylight, you could probably pick out fields, barns, a transmission line crossing the far side. At night, it was just layers of black and a few lonely points of yellow. I shut the map app and opened the standalone compass. Same thing. The needle spun freely for about 2 full turns, then shuddered and kept going. I remember laughing once under my breath because it felt like the kind of tiny electronic problem that shouldn't bother me as much as it did. But it did. Maybe because I was alone. Maybe because when everything else around you is still, one little wrong thing takes up too much space in your head. I put the phone down on my thigh and looked out over the valley. That's when I saw the light. It hung low over the dark below, not on the horizon exactly, but suspended somewhere over the valley floor. Small and white, and very steady. Bright enough to stand out immediately once my eyes landed on it, but not so bright it lit anything around it. Just a clean point in the dark. At first I thought it was a farmhouse light I'd somehow missed, or maybe a tower beacon farther out. Then I realized it wasn't attached to anything. It sat above the black line of the lower trees with empty space under it. No blinking, no movement, no beam reaching down, just one pale light hanging there as if it had been placed in the valley. I picked the phone back up without taking my eyes off the light. The compass was still spinning. That was when the two things connected in my mind and the whole mood of the overlook changed. What had been a quiet pause on the way home suddenly felt like I'd stepped into the middle of something already happening. I got out of the truck. The cold hit harder than I expected. It smelled like wet stone and leaves and distant river water. The highway behind me was empty in both directions. No headlights, no passing trucks, not even that faint road hiss you usually hear if you wait long enough. I walked to the stone wall at the edge of the overlook and looked down. The light was still there. It seemed farther than it should have been and lower than it should have been at the same time. Hard to judge distance in a valley at night, but it felt too isolated to be a house and too still to be a vehicle. I kept waiting for some second light to appear beside it or behind it, something that would turn it into a normal thing seen from a weird angle. Nothing did. I checked the phone again. The compass needle made another slow rotation, then another, like it couldn't find anything solid to lock onto. The rest of the phone was normal. Signal weak but present. Time 11:14. Battery fine. Everything else behaved exactly as it should, just not the compass. I looked back at the valley. Still there. Still perfectly steady. I remember trying to ground myself by identifying everything else I could see. One red tower light way off to the east, blinking at a normal interval. That 2 yellow house lights on the opposite slope. The white glow of a distant truck moving along a road farther south. All of that made sense. All of it behaved like things I understood. Only that single pale light didn't. I leaned on the stone wall and stared at it long enough that my eyes started doing what they do in darkness, making shapes around the edges of things. For a second, I thought there might be a darker mass around the light, something larger that the light belonged to. Then I blinked, and it was gone again, just the point. The valley was unusually quiet. That took a while to register because at first, I was too focused on the light and the phone. But once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing it. No water sound from below, no insect noise from the brush behind the wall, no wind in the bare branches along the overlook. Nothing but my own breathing and the tiny fabric rustle of my jacket when I shifted. I raised the phone and tried to film the light. On screen it looked smaller and flatter as usual. The night lost depth. The valley became one black slab, and the light turned to a pale pixel hovering in noise. I recorded anyway, mostly because not recording it felt worse. While I filmed, I glanced down at the compass again through the phone interface. Still spinning, not wildly now. More like it was circling with purpose, never landing. Passing north, slowing, then moving on. If I'd been driving by it, I would have assumed the phone had glitched and reset it. Then the light below brightened. Just a little. Not enough to become dramatic. Just enough that I caught it instantly and lowered the phone. The actual light in the valley seemed more defined now, less like a distant point and more like a small suspended object with light coming from it. It still didn't cast anything onto the land beneath. No reflected line, no glow on trees, no visible source around it. My stomach tightened. The compass on the phone slowed. I looked down at it and saw the needle begin to settle, not smoothly, but in little short corrections. North, then slightly east, then back, like it was finding its way home after being lost. At the exact same time, the light in the valley began to dim. That happened slowly enough that I had time to notice the overlap. As the compass movement reduced, the light lost intensity. Not drifting away, not going out with a snap, just fading in place. I looked from the phone to the valley and back again. The needle made one last shaky turn and landed. North. Steady. I looked up. The light was gone. Not hidden by cloud, not dropped behind the trees, gone from an empty section of dark valley where it had been a second earlier. I stood there for a long time with the phone still in my hand, watching the same patch of darkness, as if it might come back when my eyes adjusted. It didn't. The quiet stayed for maybe 5 or 10 more seconds. Then a gust of wind came over the overlook, hard enough to make the dry sign beside me rattle. Somewhere down in the trees, something small moved through leaves. A truck passed on the highway far behind me, sound arriving before the headlights hit the curve. The whole night switched back on so quickly it felt staged. I checked the video. Useless. The light was there, yes, a small steady point over a black valley, and if you watched closely you could see it get slightly brighter and then fade. But without the compass doing what it did in my hand, it just looked like any other odd night light in a distance you couldn't measure. I opened the compass app again. Perfectly steady. I turned in a slow full circle just to test it. It behaved normally now, tracking my movement exactly, calm and boring and correct. That almost made me angry, because if it had kept glitching afterward, I could have blamed the phone. But it didn't. It had gone back to being a compass the second the light disappeared. I stood out there another 10 minutes, partly because I wanted it to happen again, and partly because I dreaded getting back in the truck and having to decide whether anything unusual had happened at all. Nothing came back. Eventually I got in, started the engine, and sat with the heater blowing on my hands while the windshield cleared. I kept looking out over the valley between wipes of condensation, but it was just ridge lines and dark, and the 2 yellow farm lights on the far slope. On the drive home, the compass never misbehaved once. Neither did it the next day, or the next week. A month later, out of curiosity, I went back to the overlook around the same time of night. Clear sky again, colder this time. I parked in almost the same spot and opened the compass before even turning off the engine. Steady north. I sat there 20 minutes, maybe more, scanning the valley below. Nothing. No hanging light. No strange stillness. Only the normal little signals of a quiet place after dark. Wind in the trees, a dog barking far away, one plane crossing high overhead with proper blinking lights. I still stopped there sometimes on late drives, though not as often. And every time I do, before I look out over the valley, I glance down at the compass first. The power went out with that strange total silence you only notice after it happens. 1 second the fridge was humming in the kitchen and the little fan in the hallway was pushing air toward the bedrooms, and the next, all of it was gone. Not dimmed, not flickered, just dead. I sat up on the couch and looked automatically toward the television, even though I hadn't been watching it. The black screen reflected the room for half a second before the last of the borrowed light disappeared. The digital clock on the cable box went out. The lamp near the bookshelf went dark. The whole living room flattened into shapes. My name's Grant Holloway. I lived alone in a one-story house on a quiet residential street, the kind of place where you knew which porch light belonged to which neighbor and could tell whose dog was barking without looking outside. It was early spring, cool and damp, and I'd fallen asleep on the couch with a blanket over my legs after a long day at work. I checked my phone, 11:56 p.m. No signal problem. Battery okay. The screen was too bright in the dark, and it lit the edges of the room just enough for me to see the furniture and the framed photos over the fireplace. At first, I figured it was just the block. Power outages happened a couple times a year. Wind, transformer issue, somebody hitting a pole on the main road. Normal enough. Then I noticed the windows. They were glowing, not brightly. Not like headlights or a floodlight aimed in from the street, just a faint pale wash along the curtains and the glass, enough that the front room had this thin, bluish-gray outline to it. The house itself had no power, but the windows looked softly lit from outside. That made me stand up. I crossed the living room slowly, blanket still around my shoulders, and stopped at the front window. The street beyond was dark at first glance. No porch lights, no street lights, no warm rectangles from televisions in neighboring houses. The whole block had gone black, but something out there was providing that faint glow. It wasn't coming from one point, at least not obviously. It felt diffuse, low, like the air outside the house had picked up light from somewhere that wasn't visible yet. I pulled the curtain aside a few inches. The street was empty. Parked cars lined both curbs. Bare trees in the front yards shifted a little in the damp breeze. Every house on the block was dark, same as mine. But over the center of the street, maybe 100 yards down near the intersection, there was a soft white light drifting above the pavement. At first, I thought it was a person with a flashlight, except it wasn't pointed anywhere. Then maybe a drone, except there was no red or green blinking, no sharp beam, no sound. It moved slowly, almost lazily, from left to right above the street at about the height of the second-story roof lines, except none of the houses on my side had a second story. That gave it this wrong scale immediately. Too low to be in the sky, too high to feel like it belonged to the road. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. The night air was cold enough to wake me up fully. It smelled like wet mulch and asphalt. Somewhere much farther away, maybe over the next neighborhood, I heard a car alarm chirp once and stop. The soft light kept drifting. It wasn't bright enough to throw strong shadows, but bright enough that it seemed to tint the upper parts of the parked cars and the branches nearest it with a faint, pale edge. Not white exactly. More like the color of moonlight through thin fog, except the sky above was clear enough that I could still see a few stars between the power lines. No sound came with it. That was the first thing that really got under my skin. A drone should have buzzed. A helicopter should have filled the whole street with noise. Even a utility vehicle or spotlight from somewhere would have had some human sound attached to it. Instead, there was just the dead quiet of a blackout and this soft light moving down the center of the block. I looked left and right, expecting neighbors to be outside by then. No one. Every house dark. Every porch empty. That felt wrong too. In a real outage, somebody usually checks. A door opens. A flashlight appears. Someone yells down the sidewalk, "You lose power too?" But my street stayed sealed. Curtains closed. Front lawns empty. It felt less like the neighborhood had gone dark and more like it had gone absent. The light drifted closer to my side of the block. I could see now that it wasn't a beam or a glow in the air exactly. It had shape, but only just. A rounded pale mass about the size of a large car from my angle, though that was a guess more than anything. Its edges stayed soft enough that I couldn't fix them, and the center seemed slightly brighter than the outside. I remember thinking that if it got any closer, I should go back inside and lock the door, which made no sense because I was already standing outside, watching it like I'd been invited. Then something else happened. The windows of my own house brightened. Not from inside, from outside. The front windows, then the side window in the dining room, then even the narrow glass pane beside the back hallway, all carrying the same faint glow. I could tell because the reflection on the inside wall behind me sharpened, and the porch post cast the weakest possible edge shadow across the siding. I turned and looked back through the open door. The dark house had filled with this dim exterior light, just enough to outline the couch, the kitchen doorway, the edge of the hallway. It looked exactly wrong. A blacked-out house lit from the outside by something that wasn't the street and wasn't the moon and wasn't any light I understood. When I faced the street again, the object had stopped. It hovered over the intersection, maybe 3 houses down, perfectly still. I checked my phone screen again, mostly because I needed to do something ordinary. Still 11:56. That's what the lock screen said. I frowned and woke it again. 11:56. No passage of minutes, no text notifications coming through, no battery drop, just 11:56 sitting there as if I'd only glanced down once. I lowered the phone slowly. The pale object remained motionless over the intersection. A strange pressure had crept into the air by then. Not a sound exactly, but something like the feeling before your ears pop on an airplane. The front of my jaw felt tight. My teeth didn't hurt, but I became aware of them in a way I never am otherwise. I took one step backward toward the door. The object did not react. I took another step. Still nothing. Then, very slowly, it began to rise. Not fast, not with any kind of dramatic acceleration. It just lifted from its place above the street like something being pulled gently upward. No wobble, no sway, no beam, no engine noise, just a steady vertical ascent over the center of my dark neighborhood. As it rose, the glow on the windows changed with it. The front glass dimmed first, then the side windows, then the pale spill inside the house receded room by room like a tide going out. The whole thing felt so controlled, so exact, that it made my skin crawl. I stepped off the porch onto the walkway to keep it in view. The object rose above the power lines, then above the roof lines, and for a second I thought I might finally get a better sense of its shape against the open sky. I didn't. If anything, it became less clear as it rose, turning from a low, soft orb into a paler, flatter brightness against the dark. Then it reached a point maybe twice the height of the tallest tree on the block and disappeared. Not faded gradually, not darted away. Just there 1 second and gone the next, with nothing left behind except the empty sky and the black silhouette of branches. At the exact same moment, the streetlights came back on. Every one of them. The porch light across the street snapped alive. My neighbor's lamp in the den came up a second later. My own hallway fan started whirring inside the house. The refrigerator kicked back on with a heavy electrical thump that I heard from the porch. Normal power restored, like somebody at the utility company had thrown a switch. I stood there blinking in the sudden ordinary light. The whole block looked real again. Houses, cars, recycling bins at the curb, the wet shine on the asphalt, the glow from windows. It all came back so completely that the last minute felt impossible even while I was standing inside it. Then a door opened across the street. Mrs. Calloway from number 12 stepped onto her porch in a robe, looked up at the streetlight and called into the house, "Power's back." That was all. Not, "Did you see that?" Not, "What was the light?" Just, "Power's back." Like that was the whole event. I almost called out to her right then and asked if she'd been outside, if she'd seen anything over the intersection, if her windows had glowed too. But the moment passed. She went back inside, the door shut, and suddenly I felt ridiculous standing in the yard in pajama pants and socks. I went back into the house and checked the microwave clock. 12:01. The stove clock blinked 12. The old wall clock in the kitchen, battery powered, was still correct. My phone still said 11:56 for another second or two after I came inside. Then it jumped to 12:01 without any animation, just a quiet correction that made me stare at the screen long enough to feel stupid. I walked room to room after that, checking windows like I expected a leftover glow to cling to the glass. Nothing. Just my own reflection and the normal sodium wash from the restored streetlights outside. I didn't sleep much. Around 1 in the morning, I went online looking for outage reports. There had been one, according to the utility map, affecting a limited residential section for about 5 minutes. Cause unknown. Restored. That was it. The next day, I knocked on 2 neighbors' doors under the excuse of asking if they'd lost power too. They had. Mrs. Calloway said she'd been in bed and only woke when the air purifier stopped. The couple at number 9 said their clocks reset, but they hadn't looked outside. Neither one mentioned any glow, any light, anything over the street. For about a week after that, I found myself checking the windows whenever the house got quiet at night. Not consciously at first. Just little glances toward the glass to make sure the dark outside was behaving the way dark should. Nothing else happened. Months later, during another outage caused by a summer storm, I stood in the living room and watched the windows carefully. They stayed dark, only reflecting the occasional lightning flash in my own face, which should have made me feel better. Instead, it just made that one night feel more sealed off, like a thing that had happened once, and then folded neatly back into the neighborhood without leaving anything behind except reset clocks and a 5-minute blank on the utility map. I saw the reflection before I saw anything strange about the night itself. It was moving along the canal beside me, bright and clean on the surface of the water, like a streetlight reflection sliding across black glass. At first, I barely thought about it. There were warehouse lights farther down, a few apartment windows across the canal, and one ugly blue security lamp behind the boat storage yard. Reflections were normal there, but after a few seconds I realized that particular one didn't match any light I could actually point to. My name's Colin Mercer. I used to take the same walk most nights after work along the towpath behind the old canal district. It wasn't some scenic trail through nature or anything. It was a narrow paved path with a rusted railing in sections, chain link fences in others, and warehouse backs on one side. The canal ran dark and flat beside it, not wide enough to feel like open water, but deep enough to look black after sunset. That night had been cool and clear. No rain, no fog, not much wind. The kind of night where sound travels strangely, so you hear a train from miles off and your own shoes on the pavement seem too loud. I'd gotten off late from the bar where I worked and didn't feel like going straight home. So I parked near the bakery loading dock like I usually did and headed down the canal path with my hands in my jacket pockets and my phone at about 10% battery. The canal was calm enough that most of the reflections stayed pretty clean. A few orange streetlights from the road behind the buildings, a square of yellow from an office window over a machine shop, the red blink from a communications tower way off beyond the train yard. Then there was this one bright reflection keeping pace with me. It was whiter than the others. Narrow at first, just a pale streak in the water off to my left, maybe 15 or 20 feet out from the bank. I noticed it because it moved when I moved. Not with the water, not with the ripples, but with me. I stopped walking. The reflection stopped too. I looked up immediately, expecting to find some overhead lamp I'd passed beneath without noticing. There were power lines, stars, the edge of an old brick warehouse roof, and nothing else. No lamp above me, no drone, no bright point in the sky matching where that reflection should have come from. I looked back down at the canal. The reflection was still there. Long and pale on the black water, wavering only as much as the surface itself wavered. That was when my stomach tightened a little. I stepped forward again. It moved with me. Same speed, same distance out from the canal bank. Like something bright and invisible overhead had locked onto my pace. I remember actually smiling for a second, that stupid, uneasy smile you get when something is weird, but you don't want to admit it's affecting you yet. I told myself it had to be an angle thing. Some light behind me catching the water differently as I walked. So I stopped again, turned around, and checked every light source I could find. Behind me, the path stretched back between dark brick walls and fence line. One sodium street lamp over the maintenance gate. A lit second-floor window in a loft building. a faded sign glowing from the brewery across the next block. Nothing intense enough, direct enough, or aligned enough to throw a moving white reflection beside me like that. When I faced the canal again, the reflection had drifted maybe half a foot farther from shore. Not a lot, just enough to bother me. I moved closer to the railing and leaned over a little. The water smelled the way canals always do in old city districts: mud, oil, cold stone, a little rot. The reflection held steady on the surface beneath me, bright at the center and softer at the edges, almost like moonlight, except there was no moon out that night. At least not anywhere I could see. I checked the sky again. Nothing. Clear stars, the black outline of roofs, a thin smear of distant cloud low over the rail yard. No source. I should have just turned around and gone back to my car right there. Instead, I kept walking. The path bent slightly along the canal, passing behind a fenced storage lot full of stacked pallets and old concrete pipe. The reflection kept pace the whole time, staying beside me like a second walker I couldn't hear. That was when I began noticing other things. The water was quieter than it should have been. Not silent. I could still hear the faint slap against the retaining wall here and there. But the normal little noises had thinned out. No ducks shifting in the reeds farther up. No insects around the grass growing through cracks in the path. Even the distant traffic from the avenue had a muted quality to it, like I was hearing it through something. I slowed down on purpose. The reflection slowed too. I sped up for 4 or 5 steps, enough to feel my keys knock against my leg inside my pocket. It matched me exactly. That made the hair rise on my arms under the jacket. I took my phone out and opened the camera. The screen brightness lit my hand and part of the railing, but beyond that, everything stayed black and silver. I pointed the phone at the water. On screen, the reflection looked smaller and flatter than it did with my eyes. Still there, definitely there, but less convincing. Easy to dismiss if you hadn't already been watching it. I tried angling upward from the waterline to the sky, hoping maybe the camera would pick up some bright source I was somehow missing. Nothing, just black roofs, stars, and empty space. I lowered the phone and looked at the canal again. Still there, still beside me. I checked the time while I had the screen up, 11:43 p.m. Then I noticed I had no bars, no signal at all. That wasn't normal there. Weak sometimes, but never gone. I don't know why that mattered to me as much as it did, but it did. Maybe because it was one more thing no longer behaving the way it should. I kept walking. The canal path ran another block before crossing under an old iron footbridge and then opening briefly near a loading area behind a print shop. There were fewer lights there, and I remember thinking maybe in the darker section the reflection would finally disappear. It didn't. If anything, it became more obvious. The water under the bridge was black, except for that pale moving streak, which now looked almost too bright for the darkness around it. It passed under the shadow of the footbridge and emerged with me on the other side without losing intensity, which made no sense at all. Reflections are supposed to change when the surroundings change. This one behaved like it had its own rules. I stopped under the bridge and listened. Above me, the iron grating gave back a faint echo of my breathing. Somewhere on the other side of the canal, a loose metal sheet tapped once and settled. The reflection waited in the water just beyond the shadow line, no farther ahead than it had been before. Then I heard something like a hum, very faint. More felt than heard. Not from the water, not from the bridge. Just in the air around that section of canal, a low, steady vibration almost below actual sound. I held still and listened harder. It stayed for maybe 2 seconds, then faded so gently I couldn't tell whether it had stopped or I'd imagined it. The reflection brightened slightly at the same time. That was the first moment I felt genuinely afraid. Not jumpy, not startled, just that cold understanding that whatever I was dealing with was not getting more explainable as it went on. I stepped out from under the bridge and continued along the path because staying still suddenly felt worse. The reflection came with me, sliding over the water at exactly my pace. A block is not far until you're waiting for something to stop following you. By then, I was thinking through the dumb, practical possibilities one by one. Could somebody be across the canal, shining a flashlight down at the water and walking to match me? No, the opposite bank there was mostly fenced lots and the rear wall of an old freight building. No path. no person. I checked anyway, nothing moving, no light source, no shadow shifting behind the chain link. Could it be a reflection from my own phone screen? I turned the phone completely off and put it in my pocket. The reflection remained. Could it be from some hidden overhead light mounted on the bridge or a roof edge? I stopped again and stepped side to side, looking up until my neck hurt. Nothing. That was around the point where I became aware of how alone I was down there. No one ever used that part of the path that late, and the businesses along the canal were all dark except for a few security lights over loading docks. There were no apartments with windows facing directly toward me in that stretch. No one to wave to. No one to ask, "Do you see that too?" I reached the open lot behind the print shop, where the path widened slightly and the canal wall dropped lower. The reflection stayed beside me until I got to the middle of that opening. Then it moved ahead by maybe 3 feet. Just suddenly, no glide, no natural repositioning. 1 second it was pacing me. The next it was slightly in front of me on the water. I stopped so hard my shoes squeaked on the damp pavement. The reflection held its new position. That change in pattern hit me harder than I expected. Up until then, as strange as it was, it had at least acted like something locked to my movement. Once it moved independently, even by a few feet, it felt intentional. I looked up so fast my eyes watered. There was still nothing over the canal. No light, no craft, no shape crossing stars, nothing. When I looked back down, the reflection had dimmed. Not gone, just weaker. A pale smear now instead of a clean, bright stripe. I stood there waiting for it to brighten again, or drift back to my side, or do literally anything that would make sense. Instead, over the next few seconds, it faded more. The water below it returned to ordinary black, broken only by the distant orange of a warehouse light farther down and the occasional star reflection when the surface settled. Then it was gone. Not snapped off, not pulled away, just faded until I could no longer separate it from the canal. I kept staring at the water after that, as if it might come back if I was patient enough. Nothing did. And just like that, the ordinary sounds returned around me. A car passed on the avenue beyond the buildings. Somewhere in the reeds up ahead, something small splashed. The insects came back too, thin at first, then normal. Even the city hum seemed to rise again, familiar and ugly and comforting. I stayed there another full minute before turning around and heading back to my car. I did not take the canal path back. I cut through the print shop lot, went around to the service alley, and came back on the street where there were lamps and parked cars and actual human buildings on either side. It added 10 minutes and I didn't care. At the car, I checked my phone again. Signal had returned. Full bars, battery still 10%. Time 11:49. I almost laughed then. Not because anything was funny, but because 6 minutes had passed, and it felt like much more than that. I sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine and watched the video I'd taken. It showed the reflection, sure, a pale moving shape on black water. But without the rest of the feeling around it, it looked almost ordinary, like some odd angle of city light. The part under the bridge where the hum happened barely registered at all. I tried showing the clip to a friend a week later without much context. He said it looked like somebody on the other side of the canal had a flashlight. Maybe. Except there was no one on the other side, and when I looked up, there was nothing overhead. I still walk at night, but not there anymore. And whenever I pass water after dark now, canal, river, even a rain ditch with enough surface to catch light, I look down before I look up. I woke up because of the sound first. At least I think I did. It was low and steady, the kind of tone that sits just under a sound you can properly locate. Not loud enough to snap me awake all at once, more like something that had been there long enough to pull me up through sleep a layer at a time. By the time I opened my eyes, I was already listening to it. My room was dark, except it wasn't fully dark. That was the second thing I noticed. There was a faint blue glow in the room, weak enough that it didn't look like a lamp or a phone screen, but strong enough that I could make out the outline of the dresser, the chair in the corner, the hoodie hanging from the closet door. The ceiling had that dim, underwater look things get when light is coming from somewhere low and indirect. I lay there for a second, trying to place it. My name's Aaron Pike. I lived alone in a second-floor apartment above a dentist's office in a plain brick building on a quiet street that mostly went dead after 9. My bedroom wasn't big. Bed against one wall, dresser opposite, TV on a cheap stand near the foot of the bed. I had the usual clutter. Books stacked on the floor, shoes under the chair, a laundry basket I kept meaning to put away. The television was off. I knew that immediately because I always turned it off at the wall before bed. Not for any reason beyond habit. The little red standby light on the bottom right wasn't on. The screen was black. The room should have been dark, except for the street light bleeding through the blinds. But the blue glow was there, and the low tone was too. I propped myself up on one elbow and listened harder. The sound seemed to be coming from the TV. That didn't make sense. I'd switched it off before sleeping. I actually remembered doing it because the remote had slipped between the mattress and the wall and I'd had to reach for it. I looked at the clock on my nightstand. 2:43 a.m. The numbers were steady, not blinking. The power was on. My fan was still running by the window, though slower than usual maybe, or maybe it just sounded quieter against the tone. I sat up fully. The glow in the room seemed a little stronger from that angle. It wasn't filling the room the way a screen would if it had turned on. It was more like a blue haze spreading outward from the television stand, catching the edges of things without casting real shadows. The TV screen itself stayed black. That was what bothered me immediately. If the thing was producing light, it should have been visible on the screen. Instead, the glass looked dead, dark, almost matte. The glow seemed to be coming from around it or through it or behind it in a way I couldn't pin down. The tone continued. It was one note, maybe with another one underneath it. Hard to tell. Not musical, not a startup chime or static or feedback, just a flat, low sound that felt like it belonged in my teeth more than my ears. I swung my legs out of bed and stood up. The carpet was cold. I took 2 steps toward the TV and stopped because the blue glow noticeably brightened when I moved closer. Not all at once, just enough that the edge of the dresser on my left became clearer and the framed print over the TV stand took on a pale rim of light. The screen stayed black. I reached for the remote on the stand and pressed power. Nothing changed. The tone didn't stop. The screen didn't flicker. The glow kept slowly thickening in the room. A little more visible now against the ceiling and the lower half of the wall behind the television. I remember saying, "Come on," under my breath, like it was some ordinary electronic glitch. I pressed power again. Still nothing. Then I crouched and checked the cable box. Its little indicator light was off. The gaming console beneath it was off too. The surge strip switch glowed red, meaning power was running to the stand, but none of the devices looked active. The tone didn't come from the strip, it came from the television. I put my ear closer to the side of it. The sound was stronger there, not by much, but enough that I knew I wasn't imagining the source. It seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the set, not from the speakers exactly, more from the body of it. That was when I noticed the air smelled different. Not burning. Nothing electrical in the usual bad way. More like rain on hot concrete, but faint. Metallic too, maybe. Just enough to register as wrong in a room that should have smelled like dust and clean laundry and nothing else. I stood up and took a step back. The blue light had reached the far side of the bed by then. The blanket on top had picked up a dim bluish edge. My phone on the nightstand reflected it as a little hard line along its black screen. I grabbed the phone and unlocked it. No notifications. Normal battery. Signal full. I opened the camera and pointed it at the room, thinking maybe I was half asleep and the screen would make the whole thing look ordinary. On the phone, the glow looked weaker than it did with my eyes. The television was just a dark rectangle with a soft blue haze around it. I started recording anyway. As I held the phone up, the tone dipped lower for half a second and then returned to the same pitch. That made the skin on my arms tighten. Because until then, I could still tell myself this was some strange electrical problem, some transformer issue, some crossed signal. But the way the sound changed when I raised the phone felt reactive, even though I knew that was probably me making patterns out of panic. I lowered the phone, the tone stayed steady again. The room continued getting gradually brighter. Not by a lot. It wasn't dramatic, but the corners were no longer truly dark. I could see the texture in the paint beside the closet. I could see the silver zipper on the hoodie hanging there. The blue light had spread enough that it felt less like something coming from one object and more like a presence in the air. And still, the television screen stayed black. I walked to the blinds and looked out between them. The street was normal. One parked car under the lamp, empty sidewalk. No weird flashing lights outside, no power outage, no police, no anything. The building across the street had one lit bathroom window and everything else dark. Nothing out there explained the color in my room. When I turned back, the glow seemed brighter than before. I know that may have just been because my eyes had adjusted, but that's how it felt. The TV now looked surrounded by a pale blue aura that stopped just short of making the screen itself visible. The edges of the stand, the cable cords, the wall behind it, all had this soft, cold cast. The tone had started to feel physical. Not loud, still, but present in my chest and jaw. I went to the television and pressed the power button on the frame itself. Nothing. I unplugged the HDMI cable from the console just to do something practical. Nothing. I crouched and switched the surge protector off. That should have killed everything on the stand immediately. The red switch light went dark. The cable box stayed off. The console stayed off. The television screen stayed black. The tone continued. The blue glow remained in the room. I just stared at it, one hand still on the dead power strip switch. That was the first moment I felt actual fear instead of irritated confusion. Because once you switch off power and the thing keeps doing what it's doing, you lose the last ordinary explanation. I stood there for a second too long, then reached behind the TV itself. The plug was warm, not hot enough to burn me, just warmer than the rest of the cords. My hand shook once when I wrapped my fingers around it. I don't mind admitting that. My body had already made up its mind about the situation before my head caught up. The tone wavered very slightly. The blue light in the room seemed to thicken just for a second, as if the air above the stand had become denser than the rest. I yanked the plug out of the wall. Everything stopped. Instantly. The tone cut off so cleanly, it was like somebody had pressed mute on the whole room. The blue glow vanished at the same moment. Not fading, not collapsing into the screen, just gone. The walls dropped back into ordinary darkness. The furniture became shapes again. The room was lit only by the streetlight through the blinds and the faint green charging light on the nightstand. I was left standing there half crouched with the TV cord in my hand and my own breathing suddenly too loud. I stayed in that position for several seconds, listening. The fan in the window sounded normal again. The building pipes ticked once somewhere in the wall. A car moved far off on the main road. Everything ordinary came back so fast it made the whole thing feel staged. I plugged the TV back in. Nothing happened. No tone. No blue light. Just the little red standby LED coming on exactly the way it always did. I backed away from it and stood by the bed staring. Then I hit the power button on the remote. The TV turned on normally. Streaming menu. Volume where I left it. No blue haze. No smell, no strange tone, just some stupid home screen tiles in a dark room. I turned it off again immediately and unplugged it a second time. Then I sat on the bed with the phone in my hand and watched the video I'd started. It was useless in a way that made me angrier than I expected. The room on the screen looked dim, the blue glow present but faint, almost easy to dismiss as weird automatic exposure from the phone camera. The tone, though, that was there. Low and steady, sitting under the noise of me breathing and the little rustle of my steps on the carpet. And right at the end, when I unplugged the set, both the sound and the faint blue on the video cut off in the same frame. That was the only part that felt real enough to trust. I didn't sleep much after that. I left the television unplugged and dragged the chair in front of the bedroom door for reasons I would not have been able to explain if anyone had asked me. Then I lay in bed with the bedside lamp on and the phone video replaying every so often because I hated it and couldn't stop checking it. Nothing else happened. At daylight, the room looked stupidly normal. I inspected the outlet, the surge strip, the TV cord, everything I could think of. No scorch marks, no loose socket, no swollen power brick. The set powered on fine again when I plugged it back in, and it worked perfectly. Sound normal, picture normal, no smell, no blue glow. I even left it running for an hour while I got ready for work, half expecting it to slip back into that low tone when I stopped looking. It didn't. That afternoon, I called the manufacturer's support line and described the issue as an electrical hum and odd standby behavior. The guy on the phone walked me through a reset and asked if the screen had displayed any error code. I said no. He asked whether the room's lighting or smart home devices could have caused a perceived glow. I said no. He asked if the set had ever emitted sound while powered off before. No, he had nothing useful to offer besides monitor the issue. So I did. For a week, I kept it unplugged unless I was using it. Then I got tired of living around it and left it plugged in again. Nothing happened. Months passed. Still nothing. The TV worked, aged, and eventually got replaced for reasons that had nothing to do with that night. But every now and then, usually when I wake up in the small hours and the room feels a little too bright for no reason I can name, I hold still and listen before I move. I saw it on the second run out past the industrial edge of town, where the streetlights got farther apart and the route stopped feeling like part of the city. My name's Darren Vale. I drove the night bus for almost 6 years, mostly the late loop that went from downtown through the warehouse district, then out along a stretch of older apartments and a half-dead shopping strip before turning around near the county line. It wasn't a glamorous route. After midnight, it was mostly people coming off shifts, a couple drunks headed home, and the same handful of riders who always seemed to exist slightly outside normal schedules. That night was cold and dry, with a clear sky and the kind of sharp air that made every distant light look cleaner than it should. No fog, no clouds, no moon I could remember seeing. Just a lot of stars over the darker part of the route once the buildings thinned out. I started that run with 8 passengers. By the time I got beyond the last 24-hour gas station, I was down to 4. An older woman asleep with 2 grocery bags tucked between her shoes. A guy in a reflective work jacket slumped against the back window. A younger kid in a hoodie with earbuds in, head bobbing a little like he was dozing without meaning to. And one man up near the middle, awake but staring down at his phone so steadily he might as well have been asleep too. The bus heater was on low. It made that dry, ticking sound in the front panel every now and then. The engine noise was steady, familiar, one of those sounds you stop hearing until something changes around it. I knew that route well enough to feel each section in my hands through the wheel. The patched road by the salvage yard, the smooth stretch past the self-storage place, the slight rise near the empty billboard where the pavement always reflected the streetlights weirdly after dark. I remember glancing in the mirror just before it happened because I'd been checking whether anyone needed the next stop. Nobody moved. The older woman was still asleep. The kid in the hoodie had his chin almost on his chest. The guy at the back had one arm folded over his lunchbox. Quiet bus. Normal enough. Then the road ahead darkened for a second. Not like a cloud shadow, not like the bus went under an overpass, more like something large had passed over the lane in front of me and taken the starlight with it. I looked up instinctively through the top half of the windshield. At first I thought I was seeing an afterimage from one of the overhead street lamps behind me. Then it crossed into a cleaner patch of sky and I realized it was an actual shape. Dark, broad, wingless. That's the word I still come back to. Because my brain kept trying to turn it into a bird or a plane or anything that made sense, and it wouldn't. It crossed above the road from left to right, blotting out stars as it moved, but there were no wing beats, no navigation lights, no sound at all. It wasn't fast in the way something falling is fast. It moved with this steady gliding pace that felt controlled, too smooth, too level, affected by air the way something that size should have been. I took my foot off the gas without meaning to. The bus eased down a few miles an hour. The engine sound softened. The shape continued across the sky ahead of me, just above the line of utility poles and the dark tops of the trees that bordered the road there. No sound. That was the part that hit hardest in the moment. A night bus is never silent. Even with only 4 people on it, you hear seat springs, coat fabric, someone shifting a shoe, the vents, the engine, the road. But there should have been something from above. Rotor noise, wind, even the rustle of something huge moving through the air. There was nothing. The shape crossed in front of a cleaner patch of stars, and I saw its outline better for maybe a second. Not wings, not a fuselage. More like a smooth, thick form. Wider than it was long, though that's hard to swear to because it stayed dark against a dark sky. The only reason I could track it at all was because the stars behind it disappeared where it passed. I checked the road again because training does that to you. Even if something impossible is overhead, you check your lane first. Still empty. No deer. No stalled car. No person in the road. When I looked back up, the shape was farther right and slightly lower, though I couldn't tell if that was real or just angle. It passed over the roofline of an empty warehouse set back from the road, and for 1 second seemed to flatten against the sky like it had less thickness than it should. Then it moved beyond the darker trees and became harder to track. I looked in the interior mirror. Nobody was reacting. That honestly bothered me more than the shape itself for a second. The older woman still slept with her chin tucked into her coat collar. The guy in the work jacket hadn't moved. The kid in the hoodie had one earbud hanging loose, but his eyes were still shut. The man with the phone sat exactly as before, pale screen lighting the lower half of his face, not even glancing up. I actually said, "Did anybody just see that?" out loud. No one answered. The words sounded too small in the bust. I looked forward again, trying to pick the thing back up against the sky, and for a moment I lost it. Then I found it farther right. Just long enough to see it cross another patch of stars. Still no lights. Still no sound. Then it was gone. Not vanished in a flash. Just crossed into a section of sky over the trees where I couldn't separate it from the dark anymore. 1 second I had it, and the next there was only normal night sky and utility lines. I kept the bus moving because I had to. You can't just stop a route vehicle in the middle of a dark county road because something crossed overhead. At least that's what I told myself. The truth is, part of me didn't want to stop because stopping would have meant admitting I thought it was real. The next stop was a shelter beside an old pharmacy building that had been empty for years. I pulled in a little too fast, corrected, and opened the doors. No one got off. No one got on. I sat there maybe 5 seconds longer than usual with the doors open and the cold air pushing in, listening. I don't know what I expected. Maybe some delayed engine noise. Maybe somebody behind me saying, "What was that?" Nothing. I closed the doors and moved on. By then, my heartbeat had gotten annoyingly obvious, that heavy, out-of-proportion thud you become aware of when your body decides you're in danger before your mind has filed the paperwork. I checked the mirror again. Still nothing for passengers. The man with the phone had finally put it away, but only because he tucked his hands into his coat sleeves and leaned his head back against the seat. He looked half asleep now, too. The road curved slightly right near the county maintenance yard, and that changed my angle on the sky. I scanned for the shape again over the open field past the chain link fence. Nothing. Then one of the overhead cabin lights flickered, just once. A soft dip in return. The bus itself kept running fine. The dash stayed lit, headlights normal, but that little flicker hit me wrong enough that I looked down at the instrument cluster and checked the clock. 12. Not blinking, just 12. I knew it was after 1 a.m. by then, probably around 1:18 or 1:20 based on the route timing. I'd left the terminal on schedule. The bus clock shouldn't have been anywhere near 12. I stared at it 1 second too long and drifted a little in the lane, enough that the tires hummed over the edge line. I corrected immediately. When I looked up, something about the road ahead seemed dimmer for half a second, like the air itself had thickened. Then it was normal again. I hit the next stop, and this time the man in the work jacket got off. He stood up slowly, adjusted his lunchbox, and shuffled to the front without ever looking at me properly. I wanted to ask him if he'd seen anything back there, but the words jammed up in my throat because I knew how it would sound. He stepped off into the pool of light from the shelter, and the bus doors folded shut behind him. He never looked back at the roofline or the sky. The older woman got off 2 stops later. Same thing. Sleepy, polite nod, grocery bags, no sign she'd seen or felt anything strange. By the time I looped the bus around at the end of the line, only the kid in the hoodie and the guy with the phone were still on board. Both asleep now, or close enough. I sat in the turnaround lot with the brake on and the doors closed, staring through the windshield at a patch of weeds and a county sign in the open dark beyond them. The stars overhead looked normal. I checked the dash clock again. Still 12. I keyed the radio to dispatch, then let go before saying anything. What was I going to report? Large silent shape crossed overhead, no lights, no sound, 4 sleeping passengers, bus clock wrong. I could hear my own supervisor's pause before he'd ask if I needed relief. So I didn't say anything. I drove the return route back toward town. Nothing else crossed the sky. Nothing flickered. The passengers finally got off one by one without incident. The kid in the hoodie at the strip mall stopped. The last guy 3 blocks from the terminal, barely awake, muttering thanks without meeting my eyes. I finished the route, parked the bus, and did the normal post-run check with the maintenance guy who hated speaking more than necessary. He asked if the heater had been acting up because I'd written, "Check cabin light flicker" on the sheet. I said maybe electrical, maybe nothing. He climbed in, turned the key to accessory, and pointed at the clock. Why's this reset? It was blinking 12 now. That made my hands go cold in a whole new way. I said I didn't know, which was true, but not enough of it. I drove home in my own car under the same clear sky and kept checking above the road every time the trees opened up. Every large bird shape, every trick of shadow over the windshield made my shoulders tighten. I didn't sleep much that morning. When I finally did, it was shallow and stupid, the kind where you wake up feeling like you've been holding a position all night. The next evening before my shift, I asked dispatch if any passengers had called in complaints from the route. Sometimes people reported driver behavior, missed stops, hard braking, anything. She checked and said no. Then, almost as an afterthought, I asked if anyone had mentioned something in the sky over the county line stretch around 120. No. That should have ended it. It didn't. A few days later, I pulled the onboard footage request through the safety office under the excuse that I wanted to review a possible lane drift moment. It took some doing, but they let me watch the interior camera clip with the supervisor there. The bus interior looked almost exactly how I remembered it. Quiet. Passengers half asleep. Me at the wheel. Then, right at the time I knew the shape crossed overhead, the passengers all did the same subtle thing at once. Not waking up. Not looking up. They just went still. The older woman stopped shifting in her seat. The kid's head movement ceased. Even the guy on the phone froze with his thumb hovering above the screen for about 3 seconds. Then they all resumed their tiny motions like nothing had happened. The supervisor didn't notice anything unusual because he wasn't looking for it. I didn't say a word. I still drive nights sometimes, though not city buses anymore. And every now and then, on a quiet road with a clear sky and sleeping passengers, or sleeping passengers equivalent in the form of empty seats and dashboard lights, I'll glance up and remember exactly what it looked like to see a shape by its absence. I noticed the dark before I noticed the building. I was cutting through an industrial park I used as a shortcut home, the kind of place that looked dead even in daylight and almost staged at night. Long, low warehouses, chain-link fences, loading bays, box trucks parked nose to nose behind locked gates. Nobody lived out there. After 10, it felt like the whole area shut itself off and waited for morning. My name's Evan Rourke. I worked late shifts at a print shop on the far side of town, and if I took the main roads home, it added 20 minutes of lights and highway traffic I didn't have the patience for. The industrial park cut straight through between 2 bigger roads, and I'd driven it enough times that I barely looked at the street names anymore. That night was dry and cold. One of those nights where the air felt thin and the sky looked deeper than usual. No fog, no clouds that I could see, no wind moving trash or weeds along the curbs. My windows were up, the heater low, the radio barely on. I remember a talk show caller droning about something political while I passed the first row of shuttered warehouses and headed toward the back section where the road bent around the distribution yards. The lights out there were mostly mounted high on the warehouse corners, harsh white security lights that made everything below them look flatter and emptier than it already was. They threw clean rectangles onto loading docks and long, pale stripes across the asphalt. Every building looked half awake because of them. I came around the bend near a place called Mercer Logistics. At least that's what the faded sign out front said. And all the lights went out. Not one building. Not one side of the street. All of them. Every warehouse light I could see, every pole light in the lots, every little security flood over the bay doors, all of them shut off at once. The industrial park dropped into near darkness so fast that my eyes didn't know what to do with it. I hit the brake without thinking, enough to make the seatbelt pull tight across my chest. The radio cut into static at the same moment. A hard, dry hiss that lasted maybe a second, then silence. My headlights were suddenly the only real light on the road, except for one building. Straight ahead of me, maybe 100 yards down, one warehouse remained lit. Not brightly, not every light on it, just the exterior lights along the front face and over the loading bays, enough to separate it from the black shapes around it. Every other structure on the block was dark, but that building sat there pale and visible, like it hadn't gotten the message. I slowed almost to a stop. The road was empty. No cars parked along it, no workers outside, no forklifts moving behind chain link. Just my truck idling and the one lit warehouse ahead in the middle of a dead, dark business park. That was strange enough on its own. Then I looked up and saw the orb. It was above the lit building, hovering just over the roof line. At first I thought it was some kind of reflection in the windshield because it sat so neatly over the center of the warehouse, almost too perfectly placed. But when I leaned forward and then to the side, it stayed outside. Pale, round, and absolutely still. Not bright like a spotlight, more like a dull white sphere holding its own light inside it. It didn't blink, it didn't throw a beam, and it didn't seem to illuminate the roof beneath it, which bothered me immediately because if something bright hangs over a building at that height, you expect some kind of spill or shadow or reflection. There was none. The warehouse remained lit exactly as it had been before, with the same dead exterior floods and yellow loading dock strips, while the orb above it just existed there, detached from the rest of the scene. I remember whispering no to myself, almost like I was correcting my own eyes. I checked the rearview mirror. Everything behind me was dark too. The long row of warehouse faces I just passed had vanished into silhouettes, except for the weak wash of my taillights and one emergency exit sign glowing red on a side door farther back. I looked ahead again. The orb had not moved, not even slightly. That stillness was what started making the whole thing feel wrong in a deeper way. A drone could hover, sure, but not like that. Not so cleanly. Not without even the slightest tremor or sound. If it had been a helicopter, it would have been deafening in that dead park. If it had been some weird balloon, the air was still enough that maybe it could have lingered, but balloons don't just sit over one roof in darkness while every other building on the block loses power. I rolled forward a little, maybe 10 feet, then stopped again. The orb remained directly over the same warehouse. The radio was still dead. I reached out and turned the volume knob up and down. Nothing. No hiss now. No station. Just the screen lit with the numbers and no sound coming out. The dashboard clock, I noticed then, read 12. Not blinking, just 12. That detail hit me late because I'd been so fixed on the building and the orb, but once I saw it, I couldn't stop seeing it. I knew it was after 11:30. I'd checked the time when I left work and again when I got gas, but there it was, 12, like the truck had forgotten what part of the night it was in. I picked up my phone from the console. No signal. No bars at all. I opened Maps just to do something normal. It showed the map tiles but no blue dot, no location. I opened Bluetooth settings because I wear one earbud sometimes on the drive. No devices found. That was what made my skin go cold. Not just one thing dropping out. Everything all at once. Radio, clock, phone signal. Location. I looked up again. The orb was still there, and the lit warehouse suddenly felt less like the exception and more like the center of whatever was happening. I don't know how long I sat there staring before I noticed something else. The pale orb was not perfectly round from every angle. When I squinted, it seemed slightly flattened on the bottom, or maybe the light was brighter along one edge. Every time I thought I had the shape, it slipped away again and became just a sphere of dull white. I cracked my window 2 inches. Cold air slid in. No sound with it. No distant machinery. No hum from transformers. No insects in the dead grass along the curb. Industrial parks are never completely silent, even late at night. There's always some compressor cycling, some vent fans, some metal tick from a cooling truck body. But in that moment, there was nothing outside except the engine of my own truck, and even that sounded muted, as if the air beyond the cab had thickened. That was when I thought about turning around, just backing up, making a three-point turn, and taking the long way home. Instead, I kept watching. The lit warehouse had maybe 6 loading bays facing the road, white painted numbers over the doors, one dented dumpster near the corner, a row of empty pallet stacks beside the side entrance. I could see all of it in the fixed exterior lighting, and above it, that pale orb stayed perfectly still. Then, one of the bay lights flickered. Just once. A quick dip, then back. The orb didn't react, or if it did, I couldn't tell. I sat there with my hands still on the wheel, waiting for another flicker. It came a few seconds later, but this time 3 of the dock lights dipped together. The front face of the building darkened to shade and came back. The orb still hung there. I realized my breathing had gone shallow and forced myself to inhale deeper. The inside of the truck smelled like old coffee, dust from the floor mats, the faint plastic heat smell from the vents. Those small, ordinary things kept me anchored for another few seconds. Then the warehouse lights went out too, all of them. The last lit building on the block dropped into darkness, and the orb remained. That was the moment the fear turned from manageable to physical. It felt like my body understood something before my mind did. My hands started tingling. My chest tightened. I reached for the gear shift without really deciding to. But before I moved, the orb lowered. Not gradually. I didn't see it descend. It was just suddenly closer to the roofline than it had been before. That broke something in my thinking because it meant I couldn't trust the motion of it, only the before and after. I slammed the truck into reverse. The backup camera came on and showed the dark road behind me washed gray by my reverse lights. The picture fuzzed once with static and then stabilized. I backed up too fast, tires crunching over the rough seam in the asphalt, and kept my eyes flicking between the screen and the windshield. The orb didn't chase me. Or maybe it did, and I just couldn't tell from that angle. It stayed over the building, at least it seemed to, but my distance from it changed so badly in reverse that I lost all sense of scale. Then, just as suddenly as it had all started, every light in the industrial park came back on. All at once. Warehouse floods, pole lights, security lamps. The whole block snapped back to life with that harsh industrial whiteness. The radio blasted sound so suddenly I flinched and almost hit the curb. The dashboard clock jumped from 12 to 11:42. My phone vibrated in my hand with 3 delayed notifications, and the orb was gone. Not faded, not moving off, just gone. The sky over the warehouse was empty. I stopped the truck crooked across half the lane and sat there with the engine running and the radio now too loud, staring through the windshield at a completely ordinary industrial park. Mercer Logistics looked dead again, just another warehouse with too many lights and no soul. The other buildings were all lit as they had been before. The road signs, the fences, the dumpsters. Everything was back in place, overlit and ugly. I pulled the radio volume down to 0. Then I looked around for some sign I wasn't the only one who had just experienced whatever that was. A security guard, another car cutting through, a forklift starting up behind a bay door. Anything human. Nothing. Not a single person. I drove home the long way after that, not because I needed to, but because I couldn't make myself pass that building again from any closer than I already had. The next day, in daylight, I went back. I told myself I was only doing it because I wanted to prove to myself there was some normal explanation. Maybe a weird security drone launch pad. Maybe a tower behind the building I'd somehow never noticed. Maybe a power failure isolated to one side of the block. In daylight, the industrial park looked exactly like what it was. Faded company signs, patched asphalt, weeds in the chain link, and a lot of loading docks nobody thought about unless they worked there. Mercer Logistics was there, gray and boxy, with the same numbered bays and dented dumpster. No tower behind it, no unusual roof equipment, no scorch marks, no melted section of asphalt, nothing. I parked across the street and just looked at the roofline where the orb had hung. blank sky. HVAC units, a vent stack, nothing else. I even drove around to the back in case some service area or utility yard explained why that building had stayed lit when the others went dark. Nothing unusual. Same blank loading yard geometry as every other place out there. That should have helped. It didn't, because the more normal it looked in daylight, the less I could fit what I'd seen into it. I still use that shortcut sometimes, though not as often. And whenever I turn onto that first dead industrial stretch, I find myself checking the warehouse lights before I check the road. I had just pulled into the gas station because my fuel light had been on for about 10 miles, and I knew the next town was still a good stretch away. It was one of those small rural stations off Highway 64 in northern New Mexico, the kind with 2 islands of pumps, a tiny store, a faded ice machine, and one big highway sign tall enough to be seen over the scrub and low fences. It was late afternoon, not dark yet, but close. The sky had that washed-out orange color it gets when the sun drops behind dust in the air. It had been hot all day, but a dry wind had started pushing across the road, kicking little curls of sand through the lot. I parked at Pump 3 behind a white plumbing van. There were maybe 6 people outside. A guy in a cowboy hat was filling an old green Ford pickup. A woman with 2 kids was trying to clean bugs off her windshield. A state road crew truck was parked crooked near the air machine, and 2 workers were drinking sodas by the tailgate. I remember all of that because it felt normal, boring even. I got out, swiped my card, and the pump took forever to read it. The screen said, "Please wait," for so long that I thought the card reader was broken. Then it beeped and told me to lift the nozzle. I unscrewed my gas cap and started pumping. I had only put in maybe 2 gallons when the handle clicked off. I thought the tank was full for half a second, which made no sense. I squeezed the handle again. Nothing happened. No hum, no numbers moving, no gas flowing. Across from me, the guy in the cowboy hat slapped the side of his pump and said, "Come on." The woman at the windshield looked over and said, "Yours quit too?" The road workers both turned toward the pumps. One of them had his drink halfway to his mouth and just held it there. Then every pump screen went blank at the same time. Not dark, blank, like someone had unplugged them. The store lights stayed on, the neon beer signs in the windows stayed on. The little bell on the door still dinged when a man came out carrying a bag of chips. So it wasn't a power outage, at least not a normal one. The wind also stopped. That was the first thing that made me look up from the pump. The dust that had been sliding across the pavement just settled. The flags above the front door went limp. It got quiet in a way that felt too sudden, like the sound had been turned down instead of fading. No one said anything for a few seconds. Then one of the kids pointed toward the highway and said, "Mom, what's that?" We all looked. Above the highway sign, maybe 30 or 40 feet higher than the top of it, there was a pale round light hanging in the air. It wasn't bright like a headlight or a planet. It was more like the color of milk with a flashlight behind it. Not glowing exactly, but there. It had edges that were hard to focus on. Every time I tried to look right at it, it seemed flatter, then round again, like my eyes couldn't decide what shape it was. The big sign said Valley Sun Gas in red plastic letters with the price numbers underneath. The orb was directly above the sign pole, so centered it looked placed there. The man with the chips laughed once, but it came out wrong. "That a balloon?" he asked. Nobody answered. I remember the smell of gasoline being strong around my car. I remember the nozzle was still in my hand. I remember hearing one of the pump handles click in someone else's hand, like they had squeezed it without thinking. The orb didn't move. It didn't bob around like a balloon. It didn't drift with the air. It just sat there over the sign. Then all the pump screens came back on at once. They beeped together, a bunch of little electronic chirps at the same time, and everyone flinched a little. The numbers on my pump reset to 0. The gas started flowing again when I squeezed the handle. The wind came back too. Not slowly. It pushed through the lot all at once and blew a napkin from near the trash can across the pavement. The orb stayed there for maybe 3 more seconds. Then it dimmed, but not like a light being switched off. It looked like it moved away without moving, like it was being pulled backward into the sky. It got smaller and paler until it blended into the dusty sunset. The cowboy hat guy said, "Well, that was odd." He tried to say it like a joke, but no one laughed. I kept pumping gas because I didn't know what else to do. My hands felt stiff. I watched the numbers roll on the screen and tried to act normal. I looked toward the highway sign every few seconds, but there was nothing there anymore. Just the pole, the sign, and a few birds moving low over the road. Inside the store, the cashier was standing by the front window with her arms crossed. She looked about my age, early 30s maybe, with dark hair in a braid and a name tag that said Marisol. She had been watching too. When I went inside to get a receipt, the place had that old gas station smell of coffee, mop water, and hot plastic. The man with the chips was at the counter, asking her if the pumps did that a lot. "No," she said. "Power flicker?" She shook her head. He looked back out the window. "You see that thing?" Marisol didn't answer right away. She printed his receipt, set it on the counter, and said, "I saw something." That was all. I bought a bottle of water, even though I wasn't thirsty. I just wanted a reason to stand there for a minute and listen. The woman with the kids came in next. Her little boy kept saying it was a moon, and she kept telling him the moon wasn't there yet. The road workers didn't come inside. They just got in their truck and left fast. I asked Marisol if there was an airport nearby. She said not close. Could it have been a drone? She looked at me, then out the window again. Maybe. But her face said she didn't think so. I walked back out to my car. The sunset had gone dull and gray. The highway was mostly empty except for a semi heading west, and a dark SUV pulled off on the shoulder near the far end of the lot. I noticed it because it hadn't been there when I pulled in. It was parked facing away from us, just beyond the gas station driveway, maybe 200 yards down the road. It was black or dark blue, hard to tell in the light. No hazard lights. No brake lights, just sitting there. I got in my car and checked my phone. No signal, which wasn't unusual out there. The time said 6:47. That bothered me right away. I had left Santa Fe at 5:40. The gas station was about 40 minutes from where I started, maybe 45 with traffic, and I knew I had pulled in around 6:25 or 6:30. The pump had stopped for 30 seconds, maybe a minute at most. I had bought water and stood around for a little bit, but not 20 minutes. I stared at the clock for a while, trying to make it make sense. Then my phone jumped to 6:41. Not changed when I looked away. I was looking right at it. The minute display flickered and went backwards 6 minutes. I thought maybe the phone was searching for service and correcting itself, but it had no bars. It just sat there at 6:41 like nothing weird had happened. That was when I decided to leave. I pulled out of the lot and turned west onto the highway. The dark SUV was still on the shoulder. As I passed it, I glanced over without turning my head too much. The windows were tinted. I couldn't see anyone inside. The front end was dusty and the hood had bugs on it like it had been driving a long time. It looked like any other SUV, maybe a Chevy Tahoe or something close to it. But as I passed, all 4 of its lights came on. Not the headlights, the interior lights. For 1 second, the inside glowed a flat yellow, and I saw shapes in there, not faces. Just the shape of seats and maybe a person in the driver's seat sitting very still. Then the lights went out. I drove faster than I should have. There were no towns right away, just 2 lanes, fence lines, scrub, and low hills. The sun was almost gone, and the road ahead had that silver look it gets before dark. I kept checking my mirrors. At first, there was nothing behind me. Then, after maybe 5 minutes, there were headlights, far back, low and steady. I told myself it was the SUV, and then told myself that didn't matter. Cars drive on highways. That's what they do. But the lights stayed the same distance, no matter how fast I went. If I slowed down, they slowed down. When I sped up, they didn't gain or fall back. They just stayed there, 2 white points in the mirror. My radio had been off the whole time. I'm sure of that. I don't like music when I drive long distances because I get distracted. But the speakers made a soft clicking sound, like someone tapping a fingernail on plastic. 3 clicks. Pause. 3 clicks again. I reached over and pressed the power button. The screen lit up and showed 87.9 FM, which I never used. There was no music, just a low rushing sound and those clicks underneath. I turned the radio off. The clicking kept going for another few seconds after the screen went dark. I was gripping the wheel too hard. My palms were damp. I kept thinking about the orb above the sign and the way everyone had gone quiet at the same time. Not scared exactly, more like confused in a way that made us all feel stupid. About 10 miles from the gas station, I passed a small roadside shrine with plastic flowers tied to a white cross. My headlights caught it for a second. Right after that, I saw a light out over the fields to my right, not the orb. This was smaller and lower, maybe at fence height, moving parallel to the road. At first, I thought it was a reflection on my passenger window. I rolled the window down a crack and hot, dry air rushed in. The light was still there, sliding along beyond the fence posts. Pale again, not white exactly. It moved smoothly, with no bouncing like a flashlight in someone's hand. I slowed without meaning to. The headlights behind me slowed too. The light in the field stopped. I looked at it for maybe 2 seconds too long, and my right tires hit the rumble strip. The noise snapped me back. I jerked the car straight and sped up. When I looked again, the field was dark. I didn't stop until I reached a little town called Loma Verde, which was really just a post office, a closed diner, and a motel with half the sign burned out. My phone had 2 bars there, so I pulled into the diner lot and called my brother, Callum. He answered on the 4th ring and sounded annoyed because he was making dinner. I told him I had seen something weird at a gas station. He said, "Like what?" I tried to explain it and felt embarrassed halfway through. I said the pumps died, there was a light above the sign, and now a car might be following me. He got quiet after that. "Where are you?" I told him. "Stay on the phone," he said. "Drive to Gallup. Don't pull over again unless there are people around." That made me feel worse because Callum usually made fun of everything. While I was sitting there in the diner lot, the headlights went past on the highway. I expected the dark SUV, but it was a tan pickup with a camper shell. An old man was driving. I saw him clearly under the streetlight. He didn't look at me. He just went by and disappeared down the road. I laughed because I was relieved and embarrassed. "False alarm," I told Callum. Then something tapped the roof of my car. Not hard, just one tap. Like a small pebble had dropped onto it. I froze. Callum said, "What?" There was another tap near the back this time. I looked up through the windshield even though that didn't help. There were no trees over the lot, no power lines, nothing above me except open sky turning dark. A 3rd tap landed on the roof, right above my head. I put the car in reverse so fast I almost hit the curb. Then I drove out of the lot and back onto the highway with Callum saying my name in my ear. For the next 20 minutes, nothing happened. That was almost worse. I kept waiting for something to show up in the mirror or move beside the road. My phone call dropped twice, but Callum called back both times. The sky went fully dark. A few stars came out. The road curved through low hills and empty land. Then my headlights dimmed. Not all the way, just enough that I noticed. The dashboard dimmed too. The engine kept running fine, but the whole car felt like it had taken a breath in and was holding it. The phone call turned into static. I said, "Callum?" No answer. The clock on my dashboard changed from 7:18 to 7:18 to 7:18. It blinked the same minute 3 times without moving forward. I know that sounds impossible, but the colon flashed, disappeared, flashed again, and the numbers stayed the same. Ahead of me, something crossed the road. It was not a person. It was too low and too wide. At first, it looked like a shadow, but my headlights didn't pass through it the way they should have. It moved from left to right, maybe 50 yards ahead, smooth and slow, like a dark patch sliding over the pavement. I hit the brakes, but not hard enough to skid. The thing reached the shoulder and stopped beside a fence post. For 1 second, it had shape. Not a clear shape. More like a flat oval standing upright, darker than the land behind it. Then it folded down, or sank, or the headlights changed angle. It was just gone. My car lights came back to normal. The phone crackled and Callum's voice returned mid-sentence. "Answer me, Bay. Seriously. Answer me." I said, "I'm here." He asked what happened, but I didn't tell him. I just said the signal dropped. I drove the rest of the way with one hand on the wheel and the other holding the phone so tight my fingers hurt. When I finally got into Gallup, I pulled into a busy truck stop under bright lights and parked near the entrance. There were people fueling semis, people walking dogs, people eating fast food in their cars, normal noise, normal smells, diesel, fried food, brakes squealing. I sat there for a long time. The call with Callum was still connected, but neither of us said much. He finally told me to go inside, get coffee, and stay where there were people for a bit. I did. Inside, I checked the top of my car through the window as best I could. I didn't see damage. Later, when I got home, I looked more carefully. There were 3 small dusty circles on the roof, each about the size of a quarter, like something clean had touched the dust and lifted away. I made it home a little before 10. My place was in a regular suburban neighborhood outside Flagstaff, with porch lights and sprinklers and dogs barking behind fences. It should have felt safe, and mostly it did. I parked in the driveway and sat there listening to the engine tick as it cooled down. Before I got out, I checked my phone again. There was one new photo in my camera roll. It was black, almost completely. At first, I thought I had taken it by accident with the phone in my pocket, but the timestamp was 6:47 p.m., right when I had been sitting at the gas station confused about the time. I brightened it later, just using the regular edit tool on my phone. The picture showed the gas station sign from inside my car. The windshield edge was visible at the bottom. Above the sign was the pale orb, and in the reflection on the passenger side of the windshield there was the inside of my car. My empty passenger seat was visible. Behind it, in the back seat, there was a pale blur shaped almost like a shoulder, and the side of a head leaned forward slightly, as if someone had been sitting there watching the highway sign with me. I deleted the photo once. Then I restored it from the recently deleted folder because deleting it made me feel worse. The next morning, I called the gas station. A man answered, not Marisol. I asked if the pumps had any issues the evening before. He said, nope. I asked if Marisol was working. He said there was nobody there by that name. Then he hung up before I could say anything else. I found the station online and looked through photos. In one of them, posted 2 years earlier, there was a cashier behind the counter with dark hair and a braid. Her name tag was too blurry to read. I haven't gone back that way. I left my apartment at 5:12 because I remembered checking the microwave clock before I put my shoes on. It was still dark outside, the kind of dark where the streetlights did most of the work, and the sky looked flat instead of deep. This was in Bend, Oregon, on the east side of town, where the neighborhoods start to thin out and the roads get wider and quieter. I had been trying to run before work 3 times a week. I wasn't good at it, but I liked how empty everything felt before people started driving around. That morning was cold enough that my hands hurt for the first few minutes, but there was no wind. The air felt dry. No fog, no rain, no snow, just clear and cold. I took my usual route past the school, then down Bear Creek Road toward the paved trail that ran along the canal. I had my earbuds in, playing an old podcast I had already heard before. I kept the volume low because coyotes sometimes crossed near the drainage ditch, and I liked being able to hear cars coming up behind me. There weren't any cars, though. That was the first thing I noticed without really noticing it. Usually I saw at least one delivery truck or someone heading to the hospital for an early shift. That morning, the road felt paused. Even the traffic light at the intersection ahead looked weirdly bright, because there was nothing moving under it. I had just passed the little church with the gravel lot when both earbuds cut out at the same time. Not paused, not disconnected with a little beep, just silence. I slowed down and tapped the right earbud. Nothing. I tapped the left one. Nothing. I pulled my phone out of the pocket in my running belt, but the screen didn't light when I pressed the side button. I thought my battery had died, which annoyed me because I'd charged it overnight. I remember holding the phone in one hand and jogging kind of awkwardly while looking down at it. Then I noticed the streetlight ahead of me flicker once. It wasn't dramatic. It just dimmed, came back, then dimmed again like the bulb was old. The one behind it did the same thing about a second later, then the one behind that. It moved down the road in order, like something was passing over them. I stopped. At first I thought it was a power issue, maybe a transformer or the cold messing with the lights. I stood there in the bike lane with my breath coming out in little clouds, waiting for the sound of a pop or a hum. That was when I looked up. A dark shape moved across the stars above the road. I couldn't tell how high it was. That was the part that made my brain kind of fail for a second. It was either very large and high up or smaller and lower, but there were no lights on it, no windows, no blinking aircraft markers, nothing to give it scale. It blocked out stars as it moved. That was the only reason I could see it. The shape was smooth, not a triangle exactly, not a disc, more like a flattened oval with one side slightly wider than the other. It didn't shine. It was just a clean absence in the sky, sliding from west to east without making any noise at all. I pulled one earbud out even though there was no sound coming from it. I wanted to hear it, I guess. I wanted it to be a plane, and I wanted my ears to prove that. But there was nothing. No engine, no wind, no low rumble, not even the faint hiss you get when a jet is very high up. It passed over the church lot, then over the rooftops across the street, and kept going. I watched until I couldn't see where the edge of it was anymore. The stars were just stars again. I stood there longer than I should have. My legs had that unpleasant, heavy feeling from stopping mid-run. I looked around like maybe somebody else had come outside. Nobody had. The houses were dark except for one kitchen window with a yellow light in it. And that made me feel even stranger because it reminded me that normal people were making coffee and packing lunches while I stood in the road staring at the sky. My phone turned on when I pressed the button again. It said 5:17. The podcast started playing in my earbuds at the exact same spot where it had cut out. I remember the host finishing a sentence like nothing had happened. I almost turned around right there. I actually took a few steps back toward my apartment, but then I felt stupid. I told myself it had been a silent aircraft or some kind of drone, even though I knew that didn't really fit. I was already out and I had work later, and part of me didn't want to go home and sit with it, so I kept running. The trail started about half a mile farther down. It went behind a row of houses, then along the canal, with juniper trees and chain link fences on one side and dark open lots on the other. During the day, it was boring. Before dawn, it always felt a little too empty, but I knew every crack in that path. I had run it dozens of times. About 5 minutes after I got on the trail, I heard a clicking sound in my left earbud. Not from the podcast. This was behind it, under it, like someone tapping a fingernail on a microphone. 3 clicks, a pause, then 2 more. I pulled my phone out again and stopped the podcast. The clicking continued for maybe 2 seconds after the audio stopped. Then it cut off. I took both earbuds out and put them in my pocket. I didn't want them in my ears anymore. The canal was on my right, like a black strip of water moving slowly between concrete sides. Usually I could hear it a little, but that morning it sounded too loud. Not rushing. More like it was thick, slapping softly against the sides. I kept jogging, slower now, and I kept looking up between the branches. I didn't see the shape again. What I did see were lights on the far side of the canal. At first, I thought they were porch lights from the houses beyond the field, but they were too low. There were 3 of them, spaced unevenly, maybe waist high if a person had been standing there. They were a dull orange color, not bright enough to throw light on the ground. They moved with me. When I stopped, they stopped. I laughed once because that was the only reaction I had ready. It came out small and dumb, and it made the whole thing feel worse. I waved my hand, not a big wave, just a quick motion like I was trying to make someone admit they were there. The 3 lights stayed still. There was a footbridge ahead that crossed the canal and connected to a neighborhood street. I decided I would take that bridge and cut the run short. I wasn't panicking yet, but I had that tight feeling in my chest where every normal sound seemed like it came from right behind me. As I got closer to the bridge, the orange lights started moving again. Not toward me, parallel to me, still on the other side. They didn't bob like flashlights. They slid. I stopped again at the start of the bridge. The lights stopped. I looked at the houses beyond the field and tried to make sense of the distance. There was a fence there and some storage sheds and an empty lot where people parked RVs. It could have been someone walking behind the fence with lights on a bike or something reflective catching a lamp. That was the explanation I tried to hold on to. Then the middle light went out. A second later, the 2 outside lights moved closer together. I stepped backward without meaning to. My heel hit the raised edge of the path, and I almost fell. That small stumble finally scared me enough to move. I crossed the bridge fast, not running exactly, but close. The wooden boards were slick with frost, and my shoes made loud, hollow thumps that sounded too public in all that quiet. Halfway across, my phone buzzed. I nearly dropped it. It was in my hand because I had been trying to get it to unlock with my thumb. The screen lit up and showed a notification from my running app. Workout paused. I hadn't started a workout on the app. I had stopped using that app months earlier because it drained my battery. It was still on my phone, but I never opened it. The notification stayed on the screen for a second, then changed. Weak GPS signal. I looked up from the phone. On the neighborhood street ahead, every porch light on the block was on. I don't mean a few, I mean all of them. Both sides of the street. The little lights by front doors, garage lights, motion lights over driveways. They were all on at once, making the street look staged. No cars were moving, no dogs barked, no curtains shifted. I crossed the rest of the bridge and stepped onto the sidewalk. As soon as I did, the porch lights on the left side of the street shut off together. The right side stayed on. I knew then that I was going home. No more pretending it was a normal morning. I started jogging toward the main road, keeping to the middle of the street because I didn't want to be close to the houses or the alleys between them. I kept looking over my shoulder, but nothing was there. After a block, I heard a sound from above me. It was not an engine. It was more like pressure changing, like when someone opens a car window on the highway and the air starts pulsing, very low. Soft enough that I felt it more in my jaw than heard it. The right side porch lights flickered. I looked up again. The stars directly above the street were gone. Not all of them. Just a patch, maybe the length of 3 or 4 houses, moving slowly over the roof lines. This time it seemed lower. I could see the edge of it more clearly because it passed in front of a thin slice of moon. Smooth, dark curve, no seams, no lights, no markings. I stood in the middle of the street, staring at it, while the pressure sound pulsed in my teeth. Then my left earbud, still in my pocket, started playing the podcast by itself. The voice came out tiny and distorted through the fabric of my shorts. I grabbed it out of my pocket, and the sound stopped as soon as my fingers touched it. My phone screen had gone black again. That was when the first car appeared. Headlights turned onto the street from the far end, maybe 2 blocks away. I felt such a stupid amount of relief that I almost yelled. It was a dark Subaru, moving slowly, too slowly. It rolled toward me with its headlights on, but no engine sound I could hear. I stepped toward the curb to get out of the way. The Subaru stopped in the middle of the road about 50 feet from me. I couldn't see the driver. The headlights were aimed right at my legs, and everything behind the windshield was black. I raised one hand like, sorry, just some guy running before dawn. The car didn't move. A porch light clicked on behind me, then another, then another. The Subaru's headlights dimmed until they were barely yellow. For 1 second, I thought the car was empty. I don't know why. I just had this certainty that there was nobody inside it. Then the headlights snapped back to full brightness, and the car drove past me. It had an engine after all. I heard it clearly once it was beside me. Tires on cold pavement. A little rattle from the back. A normal older Subaru with a dent in the passenger door and a mountain bike rack on the roof. I looked at the license plate as it passed, but I couldn't remember it even 5 seconds later. I turned around and watched it continue down the block. It reached the stop sign, used its turn signal, and turned right. Completely normal. I was shaking hard by then. My hands had gone numb in a way that wasn't just cold. I walked for a minute because my legs felt unreliable, then forced myself to run once I reached the main road. The sky was starting to lighten a little in the east. Not sunrise yet, but the black had thinned into dark blue. That helped. Cars passed on the main road. A bus went by with one person sitting near the back. The world had started moving again. I checked my phone outside the school. 5:58. That made no sense. My whole route, even if I ran it slowly, should not have taken that long. From the church to the canal trail to the bridge and back toward the school should have been maybe 25 minutes. I had left at 5:12. I had looked at my phone after seeing the shape and it had said 5:17. It felt like maybe 15 or 20 minutes had passed since then. But it was almost 6. I stood by the school fence and tried to think through it step by step. I wasn't missing memory. I remembered the run, the bridge, the lights, the car. There wasn't a blank space. It was just stretched wrong, like the minutes had been too long. A man walked out of the school parking lot carrying a lunchbox, probably a custodian. I almost went over to him. I wanted to ask if the power had gone out or if he had seen anything. But when he looked at me, I realized how I must have seemed, standing there sweating and breathing hard in the dark with one earbud in my hand. I nodded and kept moving. The last weird thing happened on the street right before my apartment. There was a crow sitting on the speed limit sign. That wasn't impossible. Crows were everywhere in Bend. But it was still dark enough that it looked like a cutout, and it didn't move when I passed under it. I heard a clicking sound above me, the same pattern as before. 3 clicks, a pause, then 2 more. I stopped and looked back. The crow had turned its head sideways, watching me. I knew that sounded ridiculous, even as it happened. A bird on a sign. That was all. But the clicking came again, and it was too even, too close to the sound in my earbud. I walked the rest of the way home. My apartment building was normal. A neighbor's truck was warming up in the lot. Someone had left a bag of trash outside the dumpster. The stairwell smelled like wet concrete and laundry detergent. I unlocked my door with hands that didn't work right. Inside, the microwave clock said 5:41. My phone said 6:06. I stood in the kitchen looking between them. The oven clock also said 5:41. The cheap battery clock over my sink said 41. I checked my phone again and watched the minute change to 6:07. I didn't know what to do with that, so I showered. In the shower, I found a thin line of dirt across the front of my left shin, just above my sock. It looked like I had brushed against something dusty, but I didn't remember leaving the pavement or touching anything. My shoes were clean, except for frost melted into the mesh. No mud, no burrs, nothing from the field. When I got out, all the clocks in the apartment said 6:09. My phone said 6:09 too. That was almost worse than if they had stayed wrong. I went to work because I didn't know what else to do. I told my coworker Naomi that my earbuds had glitched during my run and I thought I saw a drone. I said it like a joke. She asked what kind of drone was out before dawn with no lights, and I shrugged because I didn't want to talk about it anymore. At lunch, I checked the local outage map. Nothing. I checked a neighborhood group for posts about weird lights or power flickers. Nothing. I even searched for military flights near Bend, which made me feel stupid, and found nothing that matched. I didn't post anything. I didn't call anyone. After work, I drove part of the route. The church lot was normal. The streetlights worked. The footbridge had frost melting in the shaded spots. Across the canal, where I had seen the orange lights, there was no path. Just a fenced utility area, dry grass, and a locked gate with a sign about irrigation district property. I stood there for a few minutes, looking through the fence. In the dirt near the gate were 3 shallow, round marks. They were probably from a utility worker's tripod or buckets or something completely ordinary. I kept telling myself that. But they were spaced unevenly about where the lights had been, and there were no footprints around them that I could see. A woman walking a golden retriever came by and asked if I was looking for something. I said I dropped a key. That lie came out so quickly it bothered me. For about 2 weeks after that, I didn't run before dawn. I went after work with people around and cars on the road. My earbuds worked fine. My phone worked fine. Nothing passed over the stars. Then, on the first morning, I finally tried again. I made it only as far as the school. The sky was clear. The air was cold. My phone said 5:19. I stopped at the corner because the traffic light was red, even though there were no cars. I waited, mostly out of habit. My earbuds were in, but I hadn't started anything yet. From somewhere above the empty intersection came 3 soft clicks. A pause, 2 more. The light turned green. I turned around and ran home. I cut through the alley behind Maple Street because the rain had finally slowed down and I wanted to get home before it started again. It was a little after 9, maybe closer to 9:20, and I had just left my sister Lena's apartment on the west side of Grand Rapids. I lived about 15 minutes away on foot, and I had walked that route enough times that I could do it without thinking. The whole neighborhood smelled like wet leaves and old pavement. It had rained all afternoon, one of those cold October rains that got into your sleeves and made everything shine under the streetlights. Most of the houses were dark, except for TVs flickering in front rooms. There was a tiger's flag dripping from somebody's porch. A plastic skeleton in a lawn chair had fallen over and was lying face down in the grass. I was halfway down the alley when I heard the hum. At first I thought it was a furnace kicking on somewhere. Then I thought it was a transformer on a utility pole. It was low and steady, not loud, but it seemed to come from every direction at once. That was what made me stop. It wasn't in front of me or behind me. It was above me, under me, in the fences, in the puddles, in my own teeth. I stood there with one hand on my hood and listened. The rain had stopped completely. That was the first strange part. A minute earlier, water had still been ticking off gutters and tree branches. Now, everything was quiet except for that hum. Even the tires from the main road 2 blocks over were gone. I looked up between the garage roofs. A dim light appeared in the gap between 2 houses. It wasn't bright like a plane. It was dull, almost the color of an old porch bulb, but flatter somehow. It hung there behind the rooftops, too low to be a star, too still to be a helicopter. I could only see it for maybe 3 seconds. Then the hum stopped. The light disappeared at the exact same time. I waited for it to come back. It didn't. The rain started dripping from the trees again, like someone had turned the sound back on. I told myself it had been a transformer. Maybe the light was something electrical arcing behind the houses. That explanation worked for about 10 steps. Then every motion light in the alley came on at once, not one after another as I passed them. All at once, up and down the alley, white rectangles snapped on above garages and back doors. I froze again. I could see steam or mist hanging over the pavement. My own shadow stretched in 4 different directions. A dog barked once from somewhere behind a fence, then stopped so fast it sounded like somebody had cut it off. I started walking faster. My phone was in my coat pocket, and I pulled it out because I wanted to call Lena. The screen came on, but the time said 9:03. That bothered me because I knew I hadn't left her place before 9. We had watched the end of a baking show, and I remembered the credits starting at 9:11. I stood under one of the motion lights and stared at the time until it changed to 9:04. Then the screen went black. I pressed the button. Nothing. I held it down. Nothing. I shook the phone like an idiot. Still nothing. The hum started again. This time it was softer. It didn't sound like a machine. It sounded like pressure, like when a big truck idled outside a window, except there was no truck and no direction to look. I felt it more in my chest than my ears. The motion lights began shutting off. They went out in pairs, starting behind me and moving forward, like something unseen was traveling down the alley in the same direction I was walking. I stopped moving because I didn't want to walk with it. The last light ahead of me stayed on. It was attached to a detached garage with peeling green paint. Under it, beside the trash cans, there was a shape I hadn't noticed before. For a second, I thought it was a person. It was about the height of a person sitting on the ground with their knees up, but it wasn't shaped right. Too narrow at the bottom, too smooth at the top. Then the light flickered, and it looked like a wet tarp folded over a stack of garden chairs. When the light steadied, it was just trash bags. I stared at those bags way too long, trying to make them turn back into something normal in my head. The hum stopped. The garage light went out. I was in darkness, except for the street light at the end of the alley. I started moving again, not running yet, but walking so fast my shoes slipped on the wet pavement. I kept my eyes on that street light like it was a finish line. Near the end of the alley, I heard footsteps behind me. Not loud, just a soft, wet scuff. Then another. I turned around right away. Nothing was there. The alley behind me was empty, but the puddles were moving. Small rings spread across them, one after another, from the far end toward me. Like rain was falling in a line, except no rain was hitting my face or my coat. I backed out of the alley onto Spencer Avenue. A car passed, and everything felt normal for about 2 seconds. It was a silver minivan with a dented bumper, going too fast through the wet street. Its tires hissed. Its brake lights reflected red in the gutter. I almost cried from relief, which embarrassed me even though no one was around. I tried my phone again. It turned on. 9:27. There were no missed calls, no warning about the battery, nothing. I called Lena, but it rang once and went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I didn't know what I would say. The fastest way home was straight down Spencer, then across Jefferson Park, then 2 blocks to my duplex. I considered going back to Lena's, but that meant returning through the alley or taking a longer route past the closed gas station. I wanted my own door. I wanted my kitchen lights and my lock and my cat Marvin yelling at me for food. So I kept walking. The hum didn't come back right away. That made it worse in a way because I was waiting for it with every step. I heard normal things again. A furnace vent rattled. Water ran through a downspout. Somewhere a man laughed inside a house, and the sound was so ordinary it made me feel like I was the one who had gone wrong. At the corner of Spencer and Valley, I saw the light again. It was between 2 rooftops across the street, just like before. Dim and round, but not perfectly round. More like a small smear of light behind thin cloud, except the sky above it was clear. It sat there above the power lines, not touching them, not moving. The hum started a second later. This time the streetlights dimmed. All 4 on the block went dull orange, then bright white, then dull again. My phone buzzed in my hand even though no call came through. The screen showed the compass app, which I hadn't opened in years. The needle spun slowly, then faster, until it was just a blur. I shut the phone off, or tried to. The screen stayed on. The light between the rooftops drifted sideways. It moved behind a chimney, but it didn't come out the other side. The hum stopped. The compass app closed by itself, and my lock screen came back. I said nope out loud. Just that. My voice sounded flat and small. I crossed the street without checking for cars and headed toward Jefferson Park. It was a small neighborhood park, not the kind with trails or woods. Just a baseball diamond, a playground, 2 tennis courts, and a line of big maple trees around the edge. Usually, I liked walking through it because it could cut 5 minutes off the trip. That night, I hated the idea of it, but the streets around it were empty and too bright. The park at least had a straight path and I could see the other side. The path was covered in leaves that stuck to my shoes. The playground was on my left. The swings hung still, not slightly moving, not creaking, just perfectly still. Then the hum came back. Every hair on my arms lifted under my coat. I stopped near the baseball backstop and looked around. There was nowhere for the sound to come from. No cars, no people, no plane overhead. The sky was low and black and broken by rooftops beyond the trees. The light appeared again. This time it wasn't between rooftops. It was behind the trees at the far side of the park, low enough that I first thought it was a bicycle headlight. But it didn't throw a beam. It just glowed from inside the branches, weak and pale, like a lamp under a blanket. The swings moved. All 4 of them pulled back at the same time, slow and even, as if someone had pushed them from the front. They hung there for a second at the same angle. Then they dropped forward. I heard the chains clink once. I started walking again, then jogging, then running. I wasn't athletic and I had a grocery bag from Lena in one hand with leftover soup in a container. It bounced against my leg and I almost dropped it. I didn't care. The hum got louder as I crossed the park. Not louder like it was closer. Louder like I was inside more of it. My ears popped. The baseball fence vibrated with a faint metallic buzz. I could feel my fillings ache. I had never noticed my fillings before that moment. Halfway across the park, my shadow appeared in front of me. That meant there was light behind me. I didn't want to look back, but I did. Above the trees at the park entrance, something dark covered part of the sky. I couldn't see a shape exactly. It was just a wide, smooth, blank place where the clouds and stars should have been. Along the bottom edge of it, there were 3 faint lights, spaced unevenly. They were not bright. They looked like reflections on black water. The hum dipped lower. The swings pulled back again behind me. I ran the rest of the way out of the park. When I reached the sidewalk on Jefferson, the sound stopped so suddenly that I stumbled. The light behind me went out. The streetlights snapped back to normal. A garage door opened somewhere nearby, and a woman in a red coat stepped out carrying recycling. She looked at me because I was bent over with my hands on my knees, breathing hard. "You okay?" she asked. I said, "Yeah, I'm fine." I wasn't fine, but I didn't want to explain why I had been running from a park with a bag of soup. She watched me for a second, then went back inside. The last 2 blocks to my duplex were the worst because they were normal. That sounds backwards, but after what happened, the normal parts felt staged. A porch pumpkin sagged in the rain. A delivery box sat under a chair. A little blue sedan had its hazard lights on with nobody in it. The world looked like itself, but I didn't trust any of it. I kept checking the gaps between rooftops. Nothing. No hum. No lights. At my building, Marvin was sitting in the front window. He always waited there around that time. But when I came up the steps, he didn't meow or paw at the glass. He just stared over my shoulder. His ears were flat. I turned slowly. Across the street, above the roofline of the old brick fourplex, the dim light was there again. It was smaller now, or farther away. It hovered just above the chimney. The hum hadn't started yet. That somehow felt worse, like the light had arrived first and the sound was still catching up. I fumbled with my keys and dropped them on the porch. The light blinked once, not like a plane, not a steady pattern, just one slow dimming, almost like an eye closing. The hum began. The porch bulb above me made a soft ping and went out. Marvin vanished from the window. My neighbor's wind chime, which had been still all evening because there was no wind, lifted straight out from the wall and held there. I got the key into the lock on the third try. Inside, everything was dark except the microwave clock. It said 9:18. My phone said 9:44. I locked the door and stood with my back against it, listening. The hum came through the wood, through the floor, through the glass. I could hear dishes faintly rattling in the sink. Marvin was under the table, low to the ground, watching the front window. The dim light leaked around the edges of the curtains. I didn't touch them. I didn't look out. I went around the apartment turning on lights, but only 2 worked. The kitchen light flickered weakly. The lamp beside the couch wouldn't turn on at all. The hum rose a little, then fell. My phone buzzed. The screen showed a voicemail from Lena. The timestamp said 9:09. I played it on speaker with my thumb shaking. For the first few seconds, there was only static. Then I heard Lena's voice, but it sounded far away and slowed down. "Marcus, are you outside?" More static, then 3 low clicks. A pause, 2 more. The message ended. I called her back right away. She answered on the second ring, sounding completely normal. I asked if she had just called me. She said no. I asked if she had left a voicemail. She said she had called at 9:09 because I had left my gloves on her couch, but I hadn't picked up. She said she didn't say anything weird. Just told me about the gloves. While she talked, the hum faded. The kitchen light came back full strength. Marvin crawled out from under the table. I asked Lena what time it was. She said 9:46. I looked at the microwave. It said 9:46 too. I stayed on the phone with her for a while and pretended I was making tea. I didn't tell her most of it. I only said the power had been weird on my walk and that my phone was acting up. She told me to stop cutting through alleys at night, which was fair. After we hung up, I checked the voicemail again. It was still there, but it had changed. Now it was just Lena saying, "You left your gloves here, dummy. I'll bring them tomorrow." No static, no clicks, no question about me being outside. I sat at the kitchen table until almost midnight with every working light on. The rain started again around 11, soft at first and then steady. Cars went by. Someone's dog barked for a long time. Marvin ate his food and acted like nothing had happened. At 12:06, the microwave clock blinked once and reset to 12's Hurullered. The phone stayed at 12:06. I got up to fix the clock, but before I touched the buttons, I heard the hum again. Very low, very far away. I walked to the front window without turning on any more lights. I stood beside the curtain, not in front of it, and looked through the tiny gap where the fabric didn't meet the wall. The street was wet and empty. Between the rooftops across the road, there was no light. Then, from behind my own building, something dim touched the edge of the window glass and slid away. I was on Route 9 just after 5 in the morning because I had agreed to open the bakery for my cousin, even though I lived almost 40 minutes away and hated driving before sunrise. It was late October, one of those damp Pennsylvania mornings where everything looked wet even if it hadn't rained. The fog was thick enough that my headlights made a white wall in front of the car. I had the wipers on low, not because rain was falling, but because mist kept gathering on the windshield. I drove that road all the time. It cut through farms and wooded patches before reaching Millvale, where my cousin's bakery sat between a pharmacy and a laundromat. There were a few houses out there, but most of the road was fields, old barns, and tree lines. No streetlights except at 2 intersections. I was tired, but not falling asleep tired. I had coffee in the cup holder, and I remember the radio was playing some local morning show with bad jokes and traffic updates for roads nowhere near me. About 15 minutes into the drive, the radio cut to static, not the normal fuzzy kind. It was a low, pulsing hiss, like someone breathing through a vent. I hit the preset button, then another. Same sound on every station. I turned it off. The car felt too quiet after that. Just the hum of the tires and the wipers dragging across the glass. A mile or so later, I passed Hensley Farm. I knew it because of the long split-rail fence and the mailbox shaped like a little red barn. My headlights caught the mailbox, then the fence posts, then something standing beside the road. At first, I thought it was a person. It was on the right shoulder, just beyond the white line facing the road. Tall and narrow. Too narrow, actually. Like a person in a long, dark coat, except the shape didn't have shoulders the right way. It looked almost like a vertical tear in the fog. I let off the gas. The car slowed from maybe 40 to 25. The shape stayed still. My headlights hit it directly, and that was when I realized I couldn't see any detail. No face, no clothes, no hands. It was just darker than everything around it. The fog moved around it, but the shape stayed sharp in the middle. I said, "What the hell?" out loud, even though I was alone. Then it rose. It didn't jump or climb or get lifted by anything I could see. It just went straight up, slow and smooth like an elevator. Its bottom left the ground first, and the whole thin shape slid upward into the fog without making a sound. I hit the brakes. By the time my car stopped, it was gone. I sat there in the lane with my foot on the brake and both hands on the wheel. My headlights showed empty shoulder, wet grass, fence posts, and fog. That was it. A pickup came around the bend behind me maybe 10 seconds later, and I had to pull forward so it wouldn't hit me. The driver honked once as he went around. I watched his taillights fade ahead of me and felt stupid for stopping in the road. I told myself it had been a tree trunk in the fog, maybe a plastic tarp caught on a fence post, maybe a person with a black rain poncho stepping backward up a slope, but there was no slope there. I knew that stretch. I drove on. The fog got thicker after Hensley Farm. It pressed right up to the windshield and my headlights didn't reach far. I slowed down and kept glancing at the shoulder, expecting to see the shape again. I didn't. Instead, I saw lights in the field to my left. 3 of them. They were low, maybe waist high if someone had been standing out there, and spaced in a straight line. Not bright, yellow-white, like old porch bulbs. They moved with me for a few seconds, keeping the same distance from the road. I blinked hard and leaned forward. The lights stopped. I kept driving and they stayed behind, fading into the fog until I couldn't see them. There were no houses in that field, no equipment sheds, nothing but soybeans most of the year and stubble after harvest. I tried calling my cousin Anna because I wanted to hear someone's voice, but my phone showed no service. That also wasn't normal. Service was spotty on that road, but never totally gone for that long. The clock on the dashboard said 5:18. I looked away, drove for what felt like several minutes, then looked again. 5:18. The colon was blinking. The car was moving. Everything else worked. But the time didn't change. I tapped the screen with one finger like that would do anything. It stayed 5:18. That was when the car behind me appeared. I noticed headlights in the rearview mirror, far back but centered in my lane. I hadn't seen anyone turn onto the road. There weren't many side roads there anyway. The headlights were high, maybe from a truck or SUV, and they had a bluish tint. I felt a little better at first. Another driver meant I wasn't alone out there. Then the headlights got closer. Not fast, just steady. Every time I checked, they were a little nearer. The fog made them look smeared and too wide apart. I slowed to 30 because I didn't want to be pushed down that road in the fog. The other vehicles slowed too. I tapped my brakes once, hoping they would back off. The headlights went out. The road behind me turned black in the mirror. I actually leaned toward the wheel and stared, trying to see if the car was still there with its lights off. The fog swallowed everything. Then a bright white flash lit up the inside of my car from behind. Not lightning. No thunder. Just one silent pulse that filled the cabin and showed my hands. The coffee cup, the passenger seat, everything. Like someone had taken a photo from the back window. I yelled and swerved toward the center line. The tires hummed over the little raised reflectors, and I corrected too hard. My coffee tipped over in the cup holder and spilled down the console. The radio turned back on by itself. Static poured out, loud enough to make me slap the power button. The screen didn't respond. I pressed it again and again, but the static stayed on. Under it, I heard a thin tone, rising and falling, almost like a kettle just before it whistles. I kept driving because stopping felt worse. A sign came out of the fog on the right, Millvale 12. That made no sense. I should have been closer than that. From Hensley Farm, Millvale was about 8 miles. I had been driving for a while after the farm. Even going slow, I shouldn't have been 12 miles out. I checked the clock, 5:18. The static cut off. The dashboard clock changed to 5:27, just like that. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. Service came back with 3 bars, and a text from Anna popped up. You close. I tried to call her, but before I could hit the button, something tapped the passenger window. It was soft, not like a rock, more like a fingernail. I turned my head so fast my neck hurt. There was nothing there but fog and the faint reflection of my own face in the glass. Then the tap came again, lower this time. I almost drove off the road. I jerked the wheel left, then right, and slowed to a crawl. My brain kept trying to make it into a branch brushing the car, but I was in the middle of the lane. There were no branches close enough. I looked at the passenger window again. For half a second, I saw a vertical smudge keeping pace with the car outside. Tall, dark, and narrow, just past the glass. Not touching it, not walking, just there. Then the fog thickened and it was gone. I started saying Anna's name over and over while I tried calling her. The call rang once, clicked, and connected, but I didn't hear her. I heard my own voice, not echoing in the car, coming through the phone speaker. It was me breathing hard, and then me saying, "What the hell?" Exactly the way I had said it when I first saw the thing by the road. I dropped the phone onto the floor mat. The call ended. I drove with both hands locked on the wheel and didn't look down to pick it up. I kept my eyes on the road, but the fog made everything close and flat. The white line appeared in pieces. Fence posts leaned out of the gray and vanished. Once I passed a driveway with a porch light glowing, and I almost pulled in, but the house looked wrong in the fog. Too quiet. No car in the driveway, no curtains lit from inside. The road curved left near an old church cemetery. I knew that curve. I had driven it hundreds of times. But that morning, the cemetery fence was on the wrong side of the road. It should have been to my right. Instead, my headlights caught the iron fence on my left, slick with mist, with the stones behind it leaning under a huge maple tree. I slowed almost to a stop. I told myself there must be another cemetery, but there wasn't. Not on Route 9. Not there. As I rolled past, I saw the same 3 yellow-white lights from the field again, only now they were inside the cemetery, lined up between the stones. They didn't bob. They didn't shine on anything. They just hung there, low and still. My phone started ringing on the floor. I didn't answer it. The name on the screen was Anna, glowing upward from under the pedals. It rang and rang. I couldn't reach it without taking my eyes off the road, and I was too afraid to stop. Then the ringing changed. It stretched out into one long tone. At the same moment, the 3 lights in the cemetery blinked off. The fog ahead of me turned bright from above. Not like sunrise. This was directly overhead, a pale, flat glow that made the road look gray and the hood of my car look white. I couldn't see the source. The roof blocked it. But it moved with me, or I moved under it for maybe 5 seconds. All the sounds in the car dulled. The engine, the tires, even my own breathing sounded far away. Then the glow slid forward over the windshield. For one moment, I saw something above the road through the fog. A large shape much higher than the telephone poles. It didn't have clear edges. It was just a darker patch inside the brightness, long and narrow, tilted slightly, like a shadow cast on smoke. The car stalled. The steering wheel went heavy. The dash lights stayed on, but the engine was dead. I rolled to a stop in the middle of Route 9. The fog closed in around me. I sat there waiting for headlights to appear behind me, or the tapping to start again, or the tall thing to step out in front of the car. Nothing happened at first. Then my driver's side mirror folded inward, slowly. It was a power mirror, but I hadn't touched the button. It just tucked itself against the door with a little motor whine. The passenger mirror folded in next. I couldn't move. I had one hand on the key and one on the wheel, but I couldn't make myself turn the ignition. Something scraped lightly along the roof from back to front. Not a branch, not metal. It sounded like a wet cloth being dragged across the car. I bent forward without thinking, almost putting my forehead on the steering wheel. The scraping stopped above the windshield. A drop of water slid down the glass from the roofline, then another, then a thin stream, clear and slow like the car had been under a hose. The weird part was that the windshield had been misty, but not wet like that. The water ran in straight lines and the wipers hadn't moved. I turned the key, the engine cranked but didn't catch. I turned it again, nothing. The clock said 5:27. The fog in front of the car shifted. A tall, narrow shadow stood in my headlights about 20 feet away. Same shape as before, only closer. It was in the road now, not on the shoulder. It leaned slightly toward the car, though I couldn't tell if it had a head. The headlights should have shown more, but they didn't. The beams seemed to stop at it. I pressed the lock button on the door. The locks clicked down, then immediately clicked back up. I pressed it again. Same thing. The shape rose a few inches. Then it stopped. My phone, still on the floor, started playing Anna's voicemail greeting. I heard her cheerful voice say she couldn't pick up, then the beep. After the beep, there was silence for a second. Then my own voice whispered through the speaker, "Don't stop in the road." I turned the key again, hard enough that my fingers slipped. The engine started. The headlights flickered once, and the shadow lifted straight up into the fog. Not fast, not blown away. It rose with the same smooth motion as before, until the bottom of it disappeared into the white above the road. I didn't wait. I drove forward under it, or under where it had been, with my whole body pulled tight. As soon as I passed that spot, the mirrors unfolded by themselves. The radio came back on with the morning show still talking, mid-laugh, like nothing had happened. A few minutes later, the fog thinned. I came out near Miller's Orchard, which was only 3 miles from Millvale. The sky had started to turn light. Not sunny, just pale gray. There were normal cars on the road now. A school bus passed me going the other direction. A woman in a Subaru rode my bumper for a while, probably annoyed that I was going so slow. When I got to the bakery, Anna was already there, standing outside in her apron with her phone in her hand. She looked mad until she saw my face. She asked why I hadn't answered. I told her I had tried. I told her the road was bad. I didn't tell her everything right away because saying it in daylight in front of the bakery felt impossible. She pointed at my car and asked what happened to the roof. There were streaks across it, long, clean lines through the damp dust, running from the back toward the windshield. The lines were straight and close together, like something flat and wide had slid over the top without denting it. My driver's side window had one mark on it too. A narrow vertical smear, about 6 feet from the ground if you measured from the pavement, even though nothing on my car sat that high unless someone very tall had leaned down from above. I checked my phone after I got inside. There were 3 missed calls from Anna, all at 5:27. There was one outgoing call from my phone to her at 5:18, lasting 9 seconds. I didn't remember making it. In the voicemail folder, there was a new recording with no caller ID. It was 12 seconds long. Most of it was road noise and static. Near the end, there was a dull tapping sound 3 times, and then a voice that might have been mine, but lower and farther away, saying it was beside the road again. I deleted it while Anna watched. Then, before I could stop it, it came back as unread. I set the tripod up on my back deck because the moon was sitting right over the roofs on the other side of the canal, and I thought I could get a decent picture before the clouds rolled in. This was in Cape Coral, Florida in late January after one of those cool days where everybody acted like it was freezing even though it was only in the 50s. The air was damp and the deck boards were slick from the mist coming off the water. I wasn't trying to do anything serious. I had a used Canon camera I bought from a guy named Victor at work, and I was still figuring out the settings. My girlfriend, Marisol, had gone to bed early because she opened the bakery the next morning, and I didn't want to keep turning the kitchen lights on and off while I messed with the lens. So I took everything outside. It was quiet for my neighborhood. Usually there was somebody grilling, somebody's music thumping from a lanai, or at least a boat bumping against a dock. That night there was almost nothing. A few frogs, a pool pump humming next door, water moving softly against the seawall. The moon looked huge through the viewfinder. Not huge in the sky really, but huge through the zoom lens. I took a few shots, checked them, adjusted the focus, took a few more. Most were bad, but a couple looked sharp enough that I got excited and kept going. Then the camera refused to focus. It wasn't on the moon. The moon was fine. It was one patch of sky just above and to the right of it. I had moved the frame because there was a thin cloud sliding in, and I wanted the moon off-center. Every time I half-pressed the shutter, the lens hunted back and forth. Whir, stop, whir, stop. The little focus square flashed red. I thought it was because the patch was empty sky. That made sense. Cameras needed contrast. I pointed at the moon again, and the focus snapped in right away. I moved back to the same dark patch. Nothing. I muttered something and switched to manual focus. I turned the ring slowly until the stars around that area were as sharp as I could get them. Then I took the picture anyway. The preview was blurry. Not all of it. The moon was soft because I had moved away from it, but the stars around that patch were weirdly smeared, like the camera had shaken only in that one spot. In the middle of the blur was a dark oval shape. I looked up with my bare eyes. There was nothing there, just moon, cloud, and a few weak stars. I zoomed in on the preview. The oval wasn't black exactly. It was darker than the sky around it, like someone had smudged the image with a thumb. Smooth edges, longer sideways than tall. It sat there in the photo where I couldn't see anything above the real rooftops. I took another picture. This one was worse. Same patch, same blur, same oval, but now it looked slightly lower. I lowered the camera and looked again. Nothing. I actually laughed because it seemed like a camera problem, and I was annoyed that I had probably bought a bad lens. I took a picture of the neighbor's palm tree. Sharp. I took one of the moon. Sharp. I aimed at the empty patch. The lens hunted again. That was when the pool pump next door stopped. I didn't notice it until the quiet settled over the deck. The frogs stopped too. The whole canal seemed to go still. I stood behind the tripod with one hand on the camera and listened. No cars on the main road, no AC units, no insects, just my own breathing and a faint ringing in my ears. Then my camera took a picture by itself. The shutter clicked once. I jumped and almost knocked the tripod over. I looked at the screen, expecting some timer setting I had accidentally turned on, but I hadn't. The new image was almost completely out of focus. The moon was a white smear on the left edge. The dark oval was larger now, closer to the center. I pressed playback and went back and forth between the last three images. In the first one, the oval was small and high. In the second, lower. In the third, larger and lower still. The timestamp on the third photo said 10:14 p.m. My phone on the patio table said 10:09. I stared at that for a while, like if I looked long enough, the numbers would fix themselves. The camera had been set to the correct time earlier. I knew because I had changed it after daylight saving ended and checked it against my phone. Now it was 5 minutes ahead. A soft splash came from the canal. Not a fish jump. I knew that sound. This was heavier, like somebody had dropped a wet towel into the water. I looked toward the seawall. The moonlight made a dull gray stripe on the canal. Nothing moved there. Then something tapped the underside of the dock. One tap, a pause, 2 taps. I didn't move. My first thought was a manatee because they came through sometimes and bumped docks. But manatees breathed loud. They stirred the water. This was a neat, dry-sounding tap under the boards, even though it had come from water. The camera screen went black. I touched the buttons. Nothing. I checked the battery door. Still closed. I switched it off and on. The screen stayed dead. My phone lit up on the table by itself. No notification. Just the lock screen. The time said 10:16 now. The camera clicked again. The screen came back after the shutter. The photo appeared for half a second before I touched anything. It showed the same patch of sky, except the oval was no longer just a smudge. It had a clean outline now. It looked smooth and solid, darker than the sky. There was a thin, pale edge along its bottom side, maybe from moonlight, maybe from the blur. I looked up so fast my neck hurt. Nothing. I walked down the 2 steps from the deck to the yard and stood closer to the seawall. The grass was wet around my sandals. I could smell brackish water and mangrove mud. Across the canal, the back of the Ramirez house was dark except for one bathroom window. Their fishing boat sat under a cover. A little ceramic pelican on their dock watched the water. The empty patch of sky was above their roof. I raised the camera without using the tripod and looked through the viewfinder. The patch was empty to my eye. The focus square flashed red. I took the picture anyway. On the screen, the dark oval sat right above the Ramirez roofline, low enough that it should have been obvious if anything was there. It covered the stars behind it. The bottom edge looked flatter now. A light came on inside the Ramirez house. Then it went off. Then their porch light came on and stayed on for about 3 seconds before dimming down to a faint orange glow. Not off, just weak, like the electricity had sagged. My own deck light flickered behind me. I turned around and saw Marisol standing inside the sliding glass door. She looked half asleep and annoyed. I could see her mouth move, but I couldn't hear her through the glass at first. Then she opened the door and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Do you see anything over there?" She squinted past me, hugging herself in her pajama shirt. "Where?" "Above the Ramirez place. By the moon." She looked for maybe 2 seconds and said, "No, come inside. It's late." Right when she said that, the camera clicked in my hand. Marisol heard it. She looked at the camera, then at me. "I didn't press it," I said. She didn't answer. She just stared at the screen with me. The new photo was darker than the others, like the exposure had changed. The oval was still there, but now there was something below it, not a beam, not a light. More like the air underneath had folded or warped, bending the edge of the roof behind it. The Ramirez chimney looked crooked in the image, leaning toward the dark shape. Marisol whispered, "Is that a drone?" I said I didn't know. We both looked up. The sky was empty. Then the low sound started. It wasn't loud. It was so low I wasn't sure it was sound at first. The deck boards trembled under my feet, and the tripod buzzed softly where it stood behind me. The canal water changed texture. That was the only way I can say it. The little ripples flattened out, and the moon reflection stretched into a straight line. Marisol stepped back into the doorway. "Evan?" The camera lens began turning by itself, slowly. Not the whole lens, just the focus ring. It made tiny clicking sounds as it moved. I nearly dropped it. I held it away from my body with both hands, like it had gotten hot. The focus stopped. The viewfinder was pointed at the canal now, not the sky. The shutter clicked. The screen showed the water in front of our dock, blurry, dark, almost useless. But in the center of the image, reflected in the canal, was the oval shape. It was directly above us. I looked straight up. For maybe 1 second, I saw it. Not clearly, not like in a movie. Just a section of sky where the stars were gone, moving without sound across the moonlight. It was smooth and dark and wide. It slid over the canal lower than any plane should have been, and there were no lights on it at all. The only reason I could tell it was moving was because the moonlit mist thinned around its edge. Marisol made a small sound behind me, not a scream, just a breath catching. The low hum sank into the ground. The oval passed over the roof of our house. Every light inside went out. I stood in the yard with the camera in my hands while the house went completely black behind Marisol. For a moment, the only light came from the moon and the weak orange porch light across the canal. Then that porch light popped back to full brightness. The shape was gone. The frogs started again all at once, too loud and too normal. Marisol said, "Get inside." I did. We locked the sliding door and stood in the dark kitchen, waiting for the power to come back. It didn't. My phone worked, though. Hers did too. We checked the outage map, but the page wouldn't load. I tried calling Florida Power and Light, and the call failed twice. The camera was still on. The battery icon showed full. It had been at half earlier. I went through the pictures with Marisol standing over my shoulder. There were 9 images of the oval. In each one, it was lower or larger or in a different place than the last. The last photo, the water reflection, was the clearest in a weird way. The shape in the canal looked dark and smooth, with one side slightly thicker, like a seed or a flattened egg. Marisol told me to stop looking at it. I stopped. The power came back at 10:31 according to my phone. The microwave flashed 12. The oven flashed 12. The camera said 10:48. That was when Marisol started crying, not loudly. She just sat on the kitchen stool and put her face in her hands. Sir, I tried to say something practical, like maybe the camera clock had glitched when the power went out, but the camera wasn't plugged into anything. She told me not to make it normal. That was exactly how she said it. We didn't sleep much. Around midnight, I heard tapping under the dock again. One tap, a pause, two taps. I didn't wake Marisol. I just lay there and stared at the ceiling fan. The next morning was bright and stupidly normal. Our neighbor, Mr. Albright, was out hosing leaves off his driveway. A lawn crew was trimming hedges 3 houses down. The canal had little waves on it from a boat that had just gone through. I walked down to the dock. There was nothing under it. No damage, no rope, no floating branch. But on the wet boards near the ladder, there were 3 dry ovals in a row. Not footprints, not paw prints, just dry patches where the mist hadn't settled. They were about the size of dinner plates, unevenly spaced. By the time I went back inside to get Marisol, they were gone. I put the camera card in my laptop after breakfast. I expected the photos to look different on a bigger screen, maybe less strange. They looked worse. The dark oval was clearer. The sky around it had weird noise, like the pixels were boiling. In the images where the roofline showed, the gutters and chimney bent slightly toward the oval. But the strangest part was the file order. The photo where the camera took a picture by itself on the tripod was listed before the first moon photo I had taken. The water reflection photo was listed with a creation time of 9:58 p.m. before I had even gone outside. The thumbnails still appeared in the order we remembered, but the file data didn't match. I copied them into a folder and backed them up on a flash drive. I didn't upload them anywhere. I didn't want people telling me it was lens flare or a bug or a fake. I already knew what lens flare looked like. I knew what bugs looked like. This wasn't that. Around lunch, Victor from work texted me asking how the camera was doing. I hadn't told him anything. His message just said, "That Canon behaved for you last night?" I stared at it for a while before answering. I asked why. He wrote back, "No reason. Mine used to hate the moon." I called him, but he didn't pick up. At work the next day, he said he had been joking. He acted confused when I pressed him on it. Then he told me autofocus could be weird at night and changed the subject. Marisol didn't want the camera in the house after that, so I put it in the garage. 2 nights later, I woke up because our bedroom wall was vibrating, not shaking. Just humming lightly like a phone on silent behind the drywall. Marisol was awake too. We didn't talk. We both listened. From the garage, the camera shutter clicked once. Then again, then again. The power stayed on, the clock stayed normal. Outside, the canal was quiet. I went to the garage in the morning. The camera was sitting on the shelf where I had left it, turned off, lens cap on. The battery was dead. There were 3 new photos on the car, all black. Not underexposed. Black. No noise, no shapes, nothing. But the timestamps were clear. 3:12 a.m., 3:13 a.m., 3:14 a.m. At 3:15, according to our doorbell camera, the motion light over the garage had turned on. The clip showed the driveway empty. Then the image blurred for 4 seconds, like the camera couldn't focus on the space in front of the door. Right before the clip ended, the bottom corner of the frame darkened. Just a curved edge passing close to the lens, smooth and oval, blocking the porch light for less than a second. The power went out while I was rinsing a plate in the kitchen sink, and at first I thought I had tripped something with the toaster oven. Everything clicked off at once. The fridge stopped humming. The light over the stove went dark. The little digital clock on the microwave disappeared. I stood there with one hand under the tap, listening to water run into the sink, and for a second the house felt larger than it was. I lived on Briar Glen Court in a quiet subdivision outside Franklin, Tennessee. It was the kind of neighborhood where every house had the same mailbox and the same short stretch of lawn. Nothing much happened there except trash pickup and kids leaving bikes in driveways. It was a warm evening in July. Not stormy. No rain, no thunder, no wind. The sky had been clear when I got home from work, and the air outside had that thick summer feeling where everything smelled like cut grass and hot pavement. I dried my hands and checked my phone. It was 8:43. I still had service, so I looked at the power company outage map. It wouldn't load. Across the street, the Harris's porch light was off too. So was the lamp in Mrs. Delgado's front window. The whole block had gone dark. I opened the kitchen drawer for a flashlight and found 3 dead ones, because of course I did. Then I remembered the old battery radio in the hall closet. It had belonged to my dad. Beige plastic silver antenna, fake leather strap. I kept it around for emergencies and never used it. I dug it out from behind a box of Christmas stuff and carried it into the living room. Before I even turned the dial, it came on, just like that. A hard burst of static filled the room. I nearly dropped it. The power knob was still clicked to off. I know that because I stared at it with the radio hissing in my hands. I turned the knob on, then off again. The static stayed. I pulled open the battery compartment and checked the batteries. 2 big D cells were inside, but one had crust on the end and the other was turned the wrong direction. The radio kept playing. I set it on the coffee table and backed away from it, which felt ridiculous. It was just a radio, an old, broken radio. But the static wasn't normal. It rose and fell in slow waves. Every few seconds there was a little gap in it, like something had moved in front of the sound. I picked up my phone to record it, and the screen went black. Not dead black. It still had battery. The screen just shut off and wouldn't wake when I tapped it. I held the side button, waited, pressed harder, and nothing happened. Then the radio made 3 sharp clicks. The room was dark except for the bluish light coming through the front windows from the sky outside. My dog, Mabel, had been asleep by the couch, but she lifted her head and looked toward the front door. The radio clicked again. Mabel stood up. I heard voices outside. Not talking exactly. More like several neighbors making confused little sounds at the same time. A door opened somewhere. Then another. Someone said, "Do you see that?" I left the radio on the table and went to the front window. At first, all I saw was the street in front of my house, darker than usual. The houses were black shapes. A few people had stepped onto porches with phone flashlights. The street lights were out. Then a white light moved over the end of the cul-de-sac. It was above the rooftops, maybe higher than the tallest oak trees, sliding slowly from left to right. It wasn't a beam. It wasn't shining down like a helicopter searchlight. It was more like a round patch of pale light moving through the air. It made no sound. I watched it pass over the McCarthy's roof, then over the maple tree in their side yard. The leaves under it looked almost gray, like the color had been drained out of them. It kept moving at the speed of someone walking. I thought helicopter first, then drone, then maybe a transformer fire somewhere reflecting off low cloud, except there weren't any clouds. The radio static behind me got louder as the light came closer. Mabel backed away from the door and pressed herself against my leg. I stepped onto the porch without really deciding to. The air outside felt wrong, too still. Usually in July, there were bugs making noise in the bushes and air conditioners running. During the blackout, the air conditioners were off, but the bugs were quiet too. My neighbor, Terrence, was standing in his driveway in pajama pants and a Titans t-shirt. His wife, Amrita, was behind him, holding their baby against her shoulder. Terrence looked across the street at me and lifted both hands like he was asking a question. I shook my head. The white light reached the center of the court and slowed. It hovered above the street, higher than the basketball hoop in the Collins' driveway, but lower than I first thought. Maybe 30 feet up, maybe 40. It was hard to judge because it didn't cast shadows the right way. It made the pavement shine, but not like a spotlight would. The light seemed to sit on things instead of coming from one point. It touched the mailbox posts, the parked cars, the grass, and the fronts of the houses evenly, without a clear direction. Then it moved toward my house. I stepped back inside and shut the door. I don't know why that felt safer. The door had a little glass window in it. The front windows were uncovered because I never closed the blinds in that room. But being outside under that light made my skin feel too exposed. The radio was still on the coffee table. The static had changed. Now there was a thin pulsing tone under it, slow and even. It matched the light somehow. I couldn't explain that. Every time the white glow outside brightened against the curtains, the tone got sharper. My phone lit up on the couch. The screen showed 8:43. That made me pause because several minutes had passed since the blackout. I had checked it at 8:43 right after the power went out. The clock hadn't moved. Then the phone screen flickered and displayed a missed call from my sister, Lana. I had no memory of it ringing. I tried to call her back. The call connected immediately, but I didn't hear Lana. I heard the same radio static, only softer, like it was coming from far away. Then I heard my own voice say, "It's over the street." I lowered the phone from my ear. I had not said that into the phone. I hadn't called anyone. But it was my voice, tired and close, like I had recorded myself by accident. The call dropped. Outside, Terrence shouted something. It was cut off halfway through, not like he stopped talking, but like the sound had been covered. The light filled my front windows. The living room turned white-gray. Every dust speck on the TV stand showed. Mabel crawled under the dining table and whined. I stood in the middle of the room holding my dead phone while the old radio kept hissing. Then the radio started picking up words. Not clear words, bits of them.